The chandeliers blazed like captive stars, showering golden light across the crystal hall of the Grand Imperial Hotel. The air smelled heavily of velvet and fresh roses imported directly from Paris, their sweet fragrance mingling with the scent of expensive champagne, the laughter of the city's richest men and women floated through the grand ballroom like a cruel symphony, masking the ruthless nature of the people who occupied the space. Tonight was the highly anticipated annual charity gala, a night where vast fortunes were shamelessly flaunted, dark corporate alliances were formed in hushed tones, and lifelong reputations could be destroyed in a single careless moment. Richard Evans, the dashing, ruthlessly ambitious young CEO of Evans Technologies, had arrived at the very center of this glittering universe. He was tall, perfectly polished in his custom-tailored tuxedo, and his hand rested smugly on the waist of a stunning brunette draped in a form-fitting crimson gown. The woman was not his wife. She was Vanessa Moore, his mistress, the woman he had been blatantly parading around the corporate office for months, carrying himself as though daring anyone to challenge his authority or his audacity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard declared into the microphone, flashing a brilliant, practiced smile designed specifically to melt resistance. "Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Evans Technologies is incredibly proud to sponsor this gala for children's education. But tonight is about far more than just business. It is about love, beauty, and the bright future we create together." His words dripped with false sincerity, a toxic syrup that coated his absolute lack of morals. But the crowd still clapped. They always clapped. Because in this world, money silences doubts, and charm covers a multitude of sins. Yet, beneath the polite applause, whispers rippled through the room like a dark undercurrent. Everyone in that ballroom knew exactly who Vanessa was. Everyone also knew that Richard's actual wife was currently 6 months pregnant. Where was she tonight? The shocking answer came with the sudden, heavy creak of the grand ballroom. Doors opening. Gasps fluttered through the hall like startled birds taking flight. Standing alone at the entrance was Clara Evans, Richard's wife, her pale hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. She wore a simple, elegant ivory dress, one that could not possibly compete with Vanessa's blinding, jewel-encrusted designer gown. Yet, her sheer presence commanded absolute attention. Her eyes, wide with the sting of betrayal but shimmering with a quiet, unbroken dignity, locked dead onto her husband. The live orchestra music faltered, the violinists losing their place as they noticed the tension. Some guests looked away in deep pity, unable to bear the sight. Others leaned forward in perverse delight, absolutely hungry for the impending scandal. Clara stepped forward, her heels tapping against the polished marble floor like a steady drumbeat of defiance. Richard froze for only a fraction of a moment before recovering his arrogant smirk. "Darling," he said, his voice smooth but sharp enough to cut glass. "I certainly didn't expect you here tonight." Vanessa laughed softly, a malicious, tinkling sound, clinging even tighter to his arm. "Oh, but isn't it just sweet? She wanted to surprise you." Clara's lips trembled, but she stood tall, refusing to let them break her in front of the world. "Surprised? No, Richard. I came here to remind you that, while you stand here proudly flaunting your mistress to the city, your child is still growing inside me. Your family is not a cheap costume you can just discard." For the night, the massive room buzzed with loud gasps. A few guests actually applauded under their breath at her sheer courage, but most held their breath, eagerly waiting for Richard's reaction. And Richard laughed. He threw back his handsome head and laughed aloud, as though the very idea of loyalty, of family, of true love, was nothing but a hilarious joke to him. His cruel laughter echoed through the crystal chandeliers, cutting and entirely devoid of empathy. Then Vanessa moved, with a dark glare of pure contempt. She stepped aggressively toward Clara. "You pathetic, sad woman," she hissed venomously. "You actually think you matter here? You're nothing but a heavy burden. Look at you, plain, weak, clinging desperately to his unborn child, as if that somehow makes you important." Before anyone in the stunned crowd could stop her, Vanessa raised her sharp designer heel and kicked Clara hard in the stomach. The grand hall instantly erupted in absolute chaos. Some people screamed in horror. Others rushed forward in a panic, and Clara collapsed heavily to her knees, desperately clutching her belly. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps, her beautiful face twisted in sheer, blinding agony. And Richard? He laughed again. He laughed as if this breathtaking cruelty was merely evening entertainment, as if his pregnant wife's physical agony was just another planned part of the night's performance. But then, a voice thundered across the massive ballroom, deep, resonant, and entirely commanding, instantly silencing every whispered rumor and every scream. Enough! The sheer force of the sound froze Richard's laughter dead in his throat. Hundreds of heads turned rapidly toward the back of the hall, where a tall, imposing figure in a pristine black suit stepped into the golden light. His physical presence was utterly magnetic, his dark storm-gray eyes blazing with a terrifying, unyielding fury. Alexander Knight, the elusive billionaire investor, had arrived. And this was only the beginning. The ballroom, which mere moments ago had been a chaotic blur of laughter and whispered gossip, fell into a stunned, breathless silence. That single word, "enough," still echoed across the crystal-lined walls, reverberating deeply through the very bones of the gathered guests. All eyes remained turned toward the grand entrance where Alexander Knight stood, his broad-shouldered figure perfectly framed by the warm golden light spilling from the chandeliers. Alexander was no ordinary man. His formidable name was whispered with reverence and fear in global boardrooms. His calculated decisions could single-handedly shift international markets, and his personal fortune was so vast that financial magazines frequently speculated whether he might one day just buy a small country for leisure. But it was absolutely not his immense wealth that froze the elite crowd tonight. It was the lethal fury blazing in his eyes. He strode forward, every single step measured and deliberate. The polished marble beneath his expensive shoes seemed to crack with the sheer force of his presence. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't even acknowledge Vanessa's existence. His intense gaze was locked solely on Clara, still crumpled on the cold floor, her trembling, pale hands clutching her swollen belly as hot tears streaked down her pale face. "Clara," Alexander said, his deep voice softer now, but still carrying enough raw strength to reach every shadowed corner of the room. He crouched gently beside her, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the elite crowd. His hands were incredibly steady as he tenderly brushed a stray strand of hair from her tear-stained face. "Are you all right? Can you hear me?" Clara's lips parted, her voice breaking, no louder than a fragile whisper. "The baby. Alexander. The baby." Something primal and fierce flickered across his handsome face. Fear, blinding, anger, and overwhelming protectiveness, all tangled into one potent emotion. Without a second of hesitation, he scooped her up, lifting her effortlessly into his strong arms. She felt impossibly light and fragile against his chest, like a bird with a broken wing. And yet, he held her and carried her as though absolutely nothing else in the entire world mattered. Richard finally broke out of his shocked silence with an arrogant scoff. "Put her down, Knight. She's my wife, not your business." That single, possessive word, wife, sent fresh murmurs rippling through the guests. Some shook their heads in utter disgust at his audacity. Others pulled out their cell phones, already recording the unfolding historic scandal. Alexander turned slowly, still holding Clara securely against his heart. His strong jaw tightened dangerously. "Your wife. You stand there and laugh while she is brutally assaulted, while your own unborn child is put in mortal danger. You absolutely do not deserve to use the word husband." Loud gasps echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Vanessa's face turned a violent shade of crimson with defensive rage. She clung to Richard's arm, her voice shrill and sharp. "This is completely ridiculous. She threw herself in front of me. I barely even touched her." But absolutely no one believed her lies. The guests had seen everything with their own eyes. Her vicious cruelty had been laid bare and exposed beneath the unforgiving glare of the chandeliers. Richard, however, was a narcissist who was not ready to back down in front of his peers. He squared his shoulders, raising his voice loudly to cover his simmering, underlying fear. "You really think your vast money gives you the right to lecture me, Knight?" Clara is my legal responsibility. I'll decide exactly what happens to her. Alexander's eyes darkened to the color of a thunderhead. No, Richard. Tonight. You permanently lost that privilege. Tonight, the entire world saw exactly who you really are. He shifted his lethal gaze across the ballroom, making absolutely sure the rolling cameras, the hungry journalists, and the gaping influencers, all of them, heard his next words clearly. And I promise you, this will not be forgotten. The crowd's murmur swelled into a crashing wave of whispers. Guests leaned eagerly into one another, their wide eyes darting back and forth between the furious tech CEO and the billionaire protector. The scandal was no longer just juicy, fleeting gossip. It was corporate and social history being written in real time. Clara clung weakly to the lapel of Alexander's expensive jacket, her hot tears soaking into the fine, bespoke fabric. She could hear the steady, calming rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, mirroring the echo of her baby's fragile life, still fighting inside her. And in the midst of the pain, she felt a tiny, warm flicker of hope, a hope she honestly thought she had lost forever. For the very first time in agonizing months, she wasn't alone in the dark. Alexander tightened his protective hold on her and started walking toward the grand exit. His voice, low but entirely unyielding, cut sharply through the ambient noise. I am taking her to the hospital. Anyone who tries to stop me will deeply regret it. Absolutely no one moved a muscle. Not even Richard. The great, gilded doors of the ballroom swung wide open as Alexander carried Clara out into the freezing night, leaving behind a room full of shattered illusions and a wicked husband whose carefully constructed empire had just begun to irreversibly crumble. And the real war had only just begun. The world outside the dark hospital windows blurred into vibrant streaks of neon, lights and passing headlights as Alexander's luxury car sped recklessly through the slick city streets. Clara, lying weakly across the plush leather of the back seat, closed her heavy eyes. Every slight bump on the asphalt road seemed to maliciously echo the sharp pain radiating deep in her belly. But as she lay there, her exhausted mind drifted somewhere else. It floated back to a time when life felt incredibly simple. Back to a warm, sunlit time before Richard, before the soul-crushing betrayal, before her body carried the heavy burdens of both profound hope and paralyzing fear. She vividly remembered the bright, optimistic girl she used to be. At 21 years old, Clara Evans had been a fierce dreamer. She grew up in a small, quiet town on the rural outskirts of Chicago, the proud daughter of a hard-working local tailor and a dedicated public school teacher. Money was always incredibly tight in their household, but the small house was overflowing with unconditional love. She spent her entire childhood happily surrounded by colorful bolts of fabrics and scattered sketches, watching her mother meticulously mend worn clothes and listening to her father's gentle guiding lessons about the irreplaceable value of honesty and kindness. From her loving parents, she inherited two vital things: a sharp, unmatched eye for physical beauty and an unshakable, deeply rooted belief that true love was always meant to be pure and kind. By the time she finally reached college, Clara had blossomed into a stunning young woman with a raw design talent that simply couldn't be ignored by her peers. She passionately studied fashion design, her intricate sketches often proudly pinned to the classroom boards by her professors as shining examples of true brilliance. Her professors constantly praised her boundless creativity, while her classmates deeply envied her natural, effortless elegance. Yet, Clara never once acted superior or arrogant. She worked grueling part-time shifts in a local campus cafe just to cover her basic living expenses. She laughed freely with her friends, and she constantly dreamed of one day owning a small, welcoming boutique where women of all backgrounds, shapes, and sizes could come and feel truly beautiful. It was during those chaotic, wonderful university years that she first met Alexander Knight. He wasn't the terrifying, untouchable billionaire he would later become. Back then, he was simply Alex, a tall, incredibly intense business student with a burning ambition that practically radiated from his very pores. They met purely by chance at a university charity project, spending long hours organizing a massive fundraiser for underprivileged kids in the city. Clara had eagerly volunteered to design and hand-paint the promotional posters. Alex had sternly volunteered to handle the complex logistics and the corporate funding. From their very first meeting in the cramped student union, their paths violently collided. She was sketching quietly at a messy table when he leaned over her shoulder, his deep, resonant voice startling her. "That's incredibly impressive. You just made our incredibly boring event look like something people might actually want to attend." She had looked up, her breath catching as she met a pair of intense, storm gray eyes. For a fleeting moment, her entire world tilted on its axis. Alex wasn't at all like the other careless, loud boys on campus. He carried himself with a quiet, imposing confidence that came not from unearned arrogance, but from pure, unadulterated vision. She had blushed deeply, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, muttering a shy "Thank you," but he had only smiled at her, a warm, breathtaking smile that would stay permanently etched in her memory for years to come. They spent the next several weeks working side by side. Clara deeply admired his relentless discipline, his uncanny ability to aggressively negotiate with wealthy sponsors twice his age, and his stubborn refusal to ever give up on absolutely anything he set his mind to. In turn, he admired her boundless creativity, her deep well of compassion, and the beautiful way she treated every single child at the fundraiser as if they were her own beloved siblings. Slowly, inevitably, their easy friendship grew into something significantly deeper. There were incredibly long, late nights spent discussing their wildest dreams over cheap, lukewarm coffee. There were accidental, electric brushes of their hands that lingered just a fraction too long. And there were profound moments of comfortable silence that spoke infinitely louder than any words ever could. But fate, as cruel and unforgiving as it often is, had entirely different plans for them. Clara's family faced sudden, devastating financial hardship after her beloved father fell terribly ill. Massive medical bills piled up relentlessly on their kitchen table, and Clara made the agonizing, heartbreaking choice to drop out of school to focus entirely on helping her parents at home, rather than selfishly chasing a budding romantic relationship that might complicate both of their futures. She had never, ever told Alex exactly how much he truly meant to her heart. She simply packed her bags and walked away quietly into the night, leaving only faded memories and unfinished sketches behind her. Years later, when she was grieving and vulnerable, she met Richard Evans. Richard was charming, highly polished, and incredibly ambitious. He represented absolutely everything that seemed secure and safe, everything she foolishly thought she needed to survive. She had successfully convinced herself that what she felt for him was true love. She convinced herself this was her one real chance at lifelong stability, at finally building the happy, secure family she'd always dreamed of having. But tonight, as the grown, powerful Alexander carried her gently out of the ruined Gala, she couldn't help but think back to the intense, brilliant boy who had once seen her true worth without ever needing her to prove it to him. The boy who had now become a man powerful enough to shield and protect her when absolutely no one else in the world would. Her pale lips trembled as she whispered softly into the comforting darkness of the moving car, the words barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Alex, why did I ever let you go?" And in the heavy, emotional silence that followed her confession, Alexander's large, warm hand found hers in the dark. He gripped it firmly and reassuringly, the physical touch acting as a solid vow, as if to silently say, "You won't ever have to let go again." While Clara lay safely in the hospital under Alexander's fierce, armed protection, the dark man at the very center of the storm, Richard Evans, stood entirely alone in his sprawling penthouse, staring blankly out at the glittering, mocking city skyline. He poured himself a heavy glass of incredibly expensive, aged scotch, the amber liquid catching and reflecting the city's pulsing neon glow. His reflection in the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who, on the polished surface, seemed utterly untouchable. He was undeniably handsome, wildly successful, and wealthy beyond the imagination of normal men. But hiding darkly behind that impeccably polished exterior was a fractured man built entirely on staggering arrogance, compulsive lies, and the specific, toxic kind of blind ambition that eventually devoured absolutely everything in its destructive path. Richard's story wasn't one born of elite privilege or old money. He had grown up bitterly poor in a cramped, drafty apartment located directly above a noisy hardware store. He was the resentful son of a tired mechanic who worked himself to the bone for pennies, and an exhausted mother who held down two grueling jobs just to keep stale food on their small table. Richard absolutely hated every single moment of his childhood. He hated the ugly, peeling paint on their apartment walls. He despised the permanent, lingering smell of motor oil and cheap sweat clinging to his father's worn clothes. He was consumed by the burning embarrassment of never, ever having enough. Even as a young, angry boy, he swore a blood oath to himself that he would never be poor again, no matter who he had to crush to rise. Ambition became his only true religion. In college, while other normal students partied and made memories, Richard obsessively studied the dark art of human manipulation. He wasn't naturally the smartest guy in the room, but he was undeniably the most ruthless. He intuitively knew exactly how to flatter vain professors, how to effortlessly charm smarter classmates into doing his heavy workload for him, and how to smoothly take full credit for brilliant ideas that absolutely weren't his own. By the time graduation arrived, he had deceitfully built a massive, elite network of wealthy connections strong enough to kick open corporate doors that raw talent alone never could have breached. His rise in the cutthroat corporate world was meteoric and bloody. At 28 years old, he brilliantly maneuvered himself into the CEO position of a struggling, desperate tech startup, smoothly promising anxious investors that he could miraculously turn the dying company around. What absolutely no one knew was that he had illegally falsified internal data, wildly inflated the financial projections, and conned desperate, trusting stakeholders into gambling absolutely everything they had on his fake vision. Against all logical odds, or perhaps entirely because of his sociopathic cunning, he actually pulled the massive scam off. The company flourished, but it didn't grow through genuine innovation or hard work. It grew through relentless, brutal cost-cutting, highly questionable vendor contracts, and illegal backroom handshake deals. By the age of 35, Richard was universally hailed as a brilliant, self-made success story. Glossy financial magazines eagerly put his handsome face on their covers, breathlessly calling him the new titan of tech. Wealthy investors literally lined up around the block to throw their money blindly at his new ventures. But those unfortunate few who worked closest to him knew the horrifying truth. His famous, winning charm was nothing but a cheap plastic mask. His highly publicized charitable generosity was a carefully calculated PR performance. Behind heavily closed corporate doors, he was incredibly cold, deeply controlling, and relentlessly cruel. That inherent, deep-seated cruelty naturally extended to his marriage. Clara had been tragically drawn in by his flawlessly polished exterior, seduced by the sweet, whispered promises of eternal safety and financial stability he poured into her ear. At first, he brilliantly played the role of the absolute perfect husband. He showered her with imported flowers, arranged candlelit dinners on private yachts, and whispered passionate vows of eternal devotion. But the exact moment the diamond ring was securely on her finger, and she was legally trapped, the charming mask slipped off and shattered. He regularly belittled her grand dreams, cruelly mocking her genuine passion for fashion. Design as nothing more than a cute little hobby for bored, useless housewives. He strictly forbade her from working a real job, aggressively insisting that her only proper place was waiting at home, or smiling blankly on his arm as a pretty accessory at galas and cocktail parties. When she finally became pregnant, he arrogantly paraded the news to the press as though the child were merely another corporate trophy, another biological proof of his unmatched virility and power. But behind closed penthouse doors, he grew significantly colder, infinitely more distant, and vastly more cruel. And then came Vanessa. To a man like Richard, Vanessa was not just a fun, disposable mistress. She was a powerful symbol, a living, breathing reminder to himself that he could easily have absolutely anything, and absolutely anyone, whenever he desired. He brazenly flaunted her around town, not out of any real, profound love for her, but out of sheer, unadulterated arrogance. Every public smile they shared, every inappropriate touch in front of his peers, was meticulously designed to emotionally break and humiliate Clara. He wanted to show the entire world that he was so powerful, he was completely untouchable, even while living in blatant sin. But Richard had a massive, festering secret, a highly dangerous one. Buried deep in the encrypted servers of his tech company were highly classified files, undeniable, hard evidence of massive corporate embezzlement, illegal shell companies, and heavily forged financial tax reports. For years, he had been illegally siphoning millions of dollars through shady offshore accounts, carefully hidden behind complex layers of fake international corporations. Only a very small handful of people even suspected the horrifying truth. And unfortunately for him, one of them was Vanessa. She absolutely wasn't with him just because she was blinded by his wealth or his perceived power. She was with him because she held the ultimate leverage over his life. She had meticulously kept hidden audio recordings, copied legal documents, and even taken incriminating photos of his private ledgers. Richard arrogantly thought he completely controlled her mind and body. In reality, she was his absolute most dangerous, ticking liability. As he took a long sip of his expensive scotch, Richard smirked into the empty room, foolishly convincing himself that he still had absolutely everything under his total control. Clara was weak and pathetic. Alexander Knight was just a temporary, annoying distraction who would soon lose interest. And Vanessa? Well, Vanessa would never dare to actually betray a man as powerful as him. But the foundational cracks in his life were already visibly forming. And very soon, the massive empire Richard had built entirely on a bed of lies would violently crumble into dust beneath his expensive shoes. Across town, Vanessa more aggressively adjusted the thin, sparkling strap of her crimson designer gown as she stared intensely at her own reflection in the massive mirror of her luxury, high-rise apartment. It was the exact same dress she had worn at the disastrous gala, and it still clung flawlessly to her perfect figure, shimmering seductively under the soft, flattering glow of the vanity lights. To absolutely anyone else looking at her, she looked like pure, unattainable perfection. She was the exact kind of breathtakingly beautiful woman who could confidently walk into any crowded room and instantly own it. But hiding darkly behind her flawless white smile was a calculating mind significantly sharper than any steel blade, and a ravenous hunger that absolutely no amount of expensive champagne or gifted diamonds could ever truly satisfy. Vanessa absolutely hadn't grown up surrounded by luxury or privilege. She was the illegitimate daughter of a struggling single mother, raised in a dead-end, suffocatingly small town where absolutely everyone knew everyone else's miserable business. From an incredibly early age, Vanessa learned two vital, inescapable truths about the world. Physical beauty effortlessly opened heavy doors, and ruthless ambition was the only thing that kept those doors from violently slamming shut in your face. By the time she turned 20, she had already permanently left that pathetic town behind in the dust, fiercely determined never to return as the poor, sad girl people pitied. She made a blood promise to herself that she would never, ever settle for anything less than absolutely everything the world had to offer. Richard Evans was certainly not her first wealthy corporate conquest, but he was undeniably her most valuable and lucrative mark. When she first joined Evans Technologies as a mid-level public relations manager, she clearly saw the golden opportunity immediately. Richard was incredibly powerful, wildly arrogant, and deeply, fundamentally bored with his life. He possessed the exact kind of fragile, massive ego that constantly craved outside validation, and the exact kind of moral weakness that fell incredibly easily to targeted, expert flattery. Vanessa happily played her assigned part perfectly. She laughed uproariously at his terrible jokes, listened intently to his endless, narcissistic rants about his competitors, and masterfully made him feel like he was the absolute, undisputed center of the entire universe. It didn't take long at all before she was significantly more to him than just another employee on the payroll. But unlike the other naive, pretty women who might have been perfectly content with receiving shiny jewelry, expensive designer bags, or secret, romantic weekend trips to Paris, Vanessa desperately wanted more. So much more. She didn't just want Richard's fleeting physical affection. She ultimately wanted his massive power, his billion-dollar company, and his prestigious last name. And above all else, she was incredibly patient. While Richard arrogantly believed he was the one holding all the cards and pulling all the strings in their affair, Vanessa was quietly, methodically, collecting devastating leverage against him, piece by agonizing piece. Late night, drunken conversations in bed were secretly recorded on her phone. While he slept, highly confidential financial documents he carelessly left open. On his glowing laptop screen were quickly and expertly photographed before he ever noticed her snooping. Damning. Illegal corporate emails were silently forwarded to a hidden, encrypted account that only she could access. Each and every single scrap of stolen information was just another powerful card in the lethal deck she was slowly building. She knew all about the illegal offshore accounts. She knew exactly how he falsified the quarterly revenue reports to trick investors. She even knew the exact names of the corrupt board members Richard had heavily bribed to secure his CEO position during the last hostile takeover. At first, discovering the sheer magnitude of his crimes had deeply terrified her. But very soon, she realized the absolute, godlike power resting in her manicured hands. If Richard ever decided to betray her, or if his pathetic wife, Clara, somehow miraculously regained her rightful place by his side, Vanessa could utterly destroy his entire life with a single attached file. And yet, she wasn't quite ready to burn it all down to the ground. Not just yet. Because Vanessa was expertly playing a much longer, grander game. The charity gala tonight had been a calculated test. She had intentionally, violently humiliated Clara, not just for her own sick, personal amusement, but to accurately gauge exactly how far Richard would be willing to go to blindly protect her over his own pregnant wife. When he had laughed aloud at Clara's pain instead of defending her, Vanessa had felt a massive surge of pure, intoxicating triumph. It definitively confirmed what she already deeply suspected. Richard was entirely hers to control and manipulate. But Alexander Knight's sudden, dramatic appearance at the gala deeply unsettled her perfectly laid plans. She absolutely hadn't anticipated a genuine titan like him stepping aggressively into the picture to defend the mousy wife. And the incredibly soft, protective way the billionaire looked at Clara, like she was someone deeply precious, someone completely untouchable, sparked a hot, violent flash of pure jealousy that Vanessa couldn't simply ignore. For the very first time in her calculated climb to the top, Vanessa sensed that she might actually not be the most dangerous, lethal player in the room. She poured herself a heavy glass of expensive red wine and sat gracefully by the massive window overlooking the glittering, sprawling city skyline. Her phone suddenly buzzed on the glass table with a new, urgent text message. It was from Richard. "We desperately need to meet tonight." Vanessa smirked, taking a slow sip of her wine. Of course, he desperately needed her right now. He always did when things got complicated. But what the arrogant Richard absolutely didn't realize was that every single desperate text message he sent her, every single whispered, illegal secret he confessed to her, only served to tie him tighter and tighter into her inescapable, sticky web. She lifted her wine glass in a mocking, silent toast to the glowing city below. "Here's to the massive empire I'm about to completely own," she whispered to her reflection in the glass. Because Vanessa absolutely wasn't just the pretty mistress playing a side role. She was the massive, impending storm that would ultimately decide whether Richard Evans rose even higher to the heavens. Or finally, violently fell all the way to hell. The private hospital room was incredibly quiet, saved only by the rhythmic, steady beep, beep, beep of the medical monitor faithfully tracking Clara's fragile heartbeat. She lay exhausted against the crisp, stark white hospital sheets, one pale hand resting highly protectively on her swelling belly. Her eyes were wide open but incredibly distant, staring blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles as painful memories swirled violently like dark storm clouds in her exhausted mind. For many long weeks, months, really, her entire life had been nothing more than a gilded cage. At home, the sprawling Evans penthouse was a towering monument to exorbitant wealth. It boasted massive glass walls, imported designer furniture, and priceless, original artwork hanging in every room. But for Clara, it had absolutely never, ever felt like a true home. It was a sterile, unforgiving museum, cold, empty, and deafeningly silent, where her joyful laughter once bravely tried to echo, but was always violently swallowed up by Richard's suffocating disdain. She vividly remembered the agonizingly long nights when she waited up alone by the massive living room window, staring out into the dark city. A carefully cooked, warm dinner slowly growing cold and inedible on the dining table. Richard would eventually stumble in long after midnight, reeking heavily of cheap whiskey and sweet, floral perfume that definitely wasn't hers. When she would ask him incredibly gentle, loving questions, "Where were you? Why didn't you just call to let me know?" He aggressively brushed her off with a cruel, condescending smirk. Sometimes, when he was in a good mood, he patted her on the head exactly like she was a slow, obedient child. Other times, he angrily barked at her to stop being so insanely paranoid and needy. And Clara, desperately eager to just keep the fragile peace in their home, swallowed her tears and stayed perfectly quiet. But maintaining that crushing silence came with a massive, soul-destroying cost. Richard's elite, snobby family was absolutely no better to her. His overbearing mother, a sharp-tongued, bitter woman who practically worshipped the ground her successful son walked on, visited the penthouse often. She constantly looked down her nose at Clara with thinly veiled, icy contempt, treating her exactly as if she were nothing more than a pretty, uneducated ornament that didn't belong on their expensive tree. You really should be on your knees grateful to him every single day, his mother would sneer over her teacup. Richard graciously saved you from a pathetic, mediocre small-town life. Always remember your proper place in this family, Clara. Even worse than the family's abuse were the constant, pitying whispers from the household staff. Clara saw the exact way the maids and chefs exchanged uncomfortable, knowing glances whenever Richard brazenly brought Vanessa back to the apartment under the flimsy, pathetic excuse of holding late-night business meetings. The terrified maids always kept their heads bowed down. But there, Deafening silence was its own form of heartbreaking betrayal. Absolutely. Everyone knew the truth. Everyone clearly saw the abuse happening. And absolutely no one ever stood up to defend her. The profound humiliation absolutely wasn't just kept private behind closed doors. It was highly, agonizingly public. At lavish, catered dinners with wealthy corporate investors, Clara was forced to sit quietly at Richard's side, completely ignored and spoken over, except for the rare occasions when a polite guest awkwardly asked her about the impending baby. Richard would laugh loudly and flirt outrageously with Vanessa directly across the table, acting exactly as if he were intentionally daring Clara to cause a public scene and react. Once, unable to bear the humiliation for another second, Clara had politely excused herself from the table and practically ran to the restaurant's luxurious restroom. Her pale hands were trembling so violently as she securely locked the velvet stall door. Hot, humiliating tears rapidly slipping down her flushed cheeks. She pressed a shaking hand firmly over her belly and whispered brokenly to her unborn child, "I'm so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry." Paralyzing loneliness rapidly became her absolute constant, closest companion. The vibrant, ambitious young woman who had once passionately dreamed of designing beautiful gowns for the entire world to wear, now tragically found herself permanently trapped inside expensive designer gowns she didn't even get to choose for herself. She was paraded around the city exactly like a shiny, silent trophy wife. Her beloved, worn sketchbooks gathered thick layers of dust. In the dark, forgotten corner of her massive walk-in closet, Richard had once cruelly called her beautiful art a pathetic waste of time, and in a fit of rage, had violently thrown one of her absolute best, hand-drawn designs directly into the roaring fireplace. She had stood there completely frozen in shock as the delicate paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. That was the exact, devastating night she completely stopped drawing forever. But the absolute deepest, most unforgivable betrayal wasn't Richard's blatant infidelity, or his relentless emotional cruelty, or even the suffocating existence of Vanessa. It was the horrifying, soul-crushing moment Clara finally realized that her entire identity had been completely erased from the world. The elite society only ever saw her as Richard's quiet wife. And even Richard himself only saw her as a highly inconvenient burden holding him back. And yet, despite the agony, she miraculously endured it all. Because every single time she sank so low she genuinely thought of giving up entirely, she felt the incredibly soft, miraculous flutter of new life moving inside her. Every tiny heartbeat, every small, sudden kick against her ribs, fiercely reminded her that she absolutely wasn't just living for her own sake anymore. She whispered desperate prayers to her baby in the dead quiet of the night, promising them a much better, safer life, promising to fiercely protect them from the monsters of the world, even if it eventually cost her absolutely everything she had left But desperate promises are incredibly fragile things when they are made by a woman who feels so utterly, completely alone in the universe. As Clara lay helpless in the hospital bed, the horrifying memory of Vanessa's sharp heel kicking her violently in the stomach replayed over and over again in her mind like a nightmare on a loop. It was a cruel, undeniable physical reminder of exactly how incredibly powerless and small she had truly become. But buried deeply beneath the physical pain and the emotional exhaustion, something ancient and powerful slowly began to stir in her soul. It absolutely wasn't a blinding, hot anger. Not quite yet. It was a cold, hard resolve. It was a tiny, resilient seed of immense strength buried deep in the frozen dirt, just patiently waiting for the right moment to grow. Because Clara finally, absolutely knew one undeniable truth. Remaining silent had almost completely destroyed her life. And silence could absolutely, no longer be her answer to the world. The loud, piercing sirens wailed frantically through the dark night. Their haunting, desperate cry cutting aggressively across the sleeping city as the heavy ambulance sped recklessly toward Lenox Memorial Hospital. Inside the claustrophobic, swaying cabin, Clara lay tightly strapped to a medical stretcher, her beautiful face as pale and white as chalk, her ragged breaths coming in incredibly shallow, painful gasps. One shaking hand aggressively clutched her swollen belly in a protective vice grip, while the other hand trembled violently as it gripped Alexander's large, warm hand with all the strength she had left. He sat rigidly on the jump seat right beside her, stubbornly refusing to let go of her fingers, his intense gray eyes absolutely never leaving her pale face for a single second. "Stay with me, Clara," he whispered fiercely, his normally commanding voice incredibly rough and thick with raw fear. "You have to stay strong for the baby. Just keep looking at me." Clara tried desperately to smile at him to ease his panic, but her pale lips merely quivered in agony. "I absolutely can't lose this innocent child, Alex. It's literally all I have left in the world." Her broken words violently tore at his heart like jagged claws. Alexander Knight had personally seen countless massive corporate business deals completely collapse. He had watched vast fortunes vanish into thin air overnight. And he had seen global empires crumble to dust. But absolutely nothing in his entire high-stakes life had ever managed to shake him to his absolute core quite like this exact moment. The terrifying thought of Clara, so incredibly fragile, so utterly broken, fighting desperately not only for her own survival, but for the tiny, fragile heartbeat fading inside her, was almost entirely too much for him to bear. The lead paramedic suddenly called out loudly over the noise of the siren. "Her blood pressure is dropping way too fast. We need to move her right now. Step on it." Within agonizing minutes, the heavy ambulance screeched violently to a halt at the emergency bay, and Clara was aggressively rushed through the hospital's automatic sliding glass doors, a highly trained team of trauma nurses completely swarmed her stretcher, rapidly pushing the squeaking gurney down a blindingly bright, white corridor that smelled overwhelmingly of harsh antiseptic and sheer, unadulterated human fear. Alexander quickly followed right behind them, his incredibly long, purposeful strides easily matching their frantic, hurried pace. Once inside the restricted emergency room, a team of doctors worked incredibly, quickly and efficiently, shouting out vitals, starting 4 lines, and hastily preparing a mobile ultrasound machine. Alexander was forced to stand helplessly just outside the thick glass wall of the trauma room, his large fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles turned stark white. He absolutely wasn't used to waiting around for news. He was entirely used to aggressively commanding rooms, to effortlessly controlling the narrative, to bending the entire world strictly to his iron will. But right now, he could do absolutely nothing but stand there and watch through the glass as the beautiful woman he had once known so well, the woman he had secretly, honestly never stopped caring for, fought a desperate, bloody battle just to hold on to her life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a weary doctor wearing blue scrubs stepped out into the hallway. Mr. Knight. Alexander turned around so sharply he nearly knocked over a cart. How is she? How is the baby doing? The senior doctor's expression was incredibly serious, but deeply calm. It's a highly complicated situation. The baby's fetal heartbeat is currently still strong, but the mother is under severe, catastrophic physical and emotional stress. She desperately needs absolute, uninterrupted rest, intensive medical care, and strictly zero emotional strain moving forward. If she experiences another massive shock or trauma like she did tonight, both of their lives could be in critical danger. Alexander's strong jaw tightened until the muscles jumped beneath his skin. She absolutely will not go through anything like that ever again. I will personally make damn sure of it. The exhausted doctor gave a very curt, approving nod before quickly returning. Inside the trauma room, Alexander leaned heavily forward and pressed his hot forehead against the cool, thick glass, his rapid breath visibly fogging the smooth surface. He watched Clara lying there in the hospital bed, looking so incredibly small, so heartbreakingly fragile, and he swore a violent, silent blood oath to the universe right then and there that Richard Evans would absolutely never, ever be allowed to hurt her again. But far outside the quiet, sterile hospital walls, the massive story had already begun to aggressively spread like a contagious virus. The charity gala had been absolutely filled to the brim with the city's most powerful, elite, and intensely gossip-hungry individuals. Hundreds of cell phones had eagerly and clearly recorded absolutely everything that went down. They caught Vanessa's shockingly cruel, venomous words. They recorded her vicious, unprovoked physical kick to a pregnant woman's stomach. They caught Richard's sickening, mocking laughter echoing in the hall, and they perfectly captured Alexander's furious, thunderous, cinematic entrance to save her. By the stroke of midnight, the unedited video had gone massively, globally, viral. Every major news outlet, blog, and tabloid plastered huge, screaming red headlines across their front pages and websites. Disgraced CEO's mistress brutally attacks pregnant wife at high society gala. Richard Evans laughs maniacally while pregnant wife suffers. Billionaire. Alexander Knight steps in, a true hero's shocking arrival. The exact same fickle, elite world that had once blindly admired and praised. Richard's ruthless business acumen now violently turned on him with a ravenous vengeance. Panicked investors began frantically calling his corporate office in the middle of the night, furiously demanding immediate explanations. Terrified, board members anxiously whispered on secure lines about calling emergency meetings to oust him. His highly paid PR team scrambled desperately to do damage control, but absolutely no amount of clever corporate spin could ever erase the horrifying HD video image of a wealthy husband laughing happily while his pregnant wife collapsed in sheer agony on a marble floor. Inside the quiet hospital room, Clara finally stirred in her bed. She opened her heavy eyes incredibly slowly, the blindingly bright fluorescent lights stinging her retinas. Sitting faithfully right beside her bed, Alexander Knight was leaning forward in a plastic chair. His expensive designer suit was heavily rumpled, and his handsome face looked incredibly weary, but his eyes were blazing with fierce, protective determination. He leaned in instantly the exact second he saw her dark eyes finally open. "You're completely safe now," he said incredibly softly, his voice a soothing rumble. "The baby is perfectly safe." Hot, grateful tears instantly welled up and spilled over her eyelashes. "Why are you actually here, Alex? Why do you honestly still care about me after all these long years?" He reached out incredibly gently and took her small hand in his deep voice, low but unshakably steady. "Because I absolutely never should have let you go in the first place, Clara. And because absolutely no one is ever going to hurt you again while I am still drawing breath." In that profound, quiet moment, Clara's battered heart physically trembled in her chest. For the very first time in agonizing months, she felt significantly more than just paralyzing fear. She felt the absolute faintest, warmest spark of genuine hope ignite in her soul. But entirely outside those safe, secure hospital walls, a humiliated Richard was already frantically plotting his revenge, and a cornered Vanessa was aggressively sharpening her toxic knives. The massive storm had only just begun to make landfall. By the time the first rays of dawn broke over the city, the entire hospital was completely surrounded. A massive, chaotic mob of aggressive reporters, hungry photographers, and intrusive camera crews heavily crowded the main entrance. Their bright camera flashes popped relentlessly like rapid fireworks every single time a random nurse or doctor tried to step outside the sliding doors. The horrific Gala scandal had spread exactly like a raging wildfire overnight, and the entire watching world desperately wanted blood and answers. Inside Clara's highly secure, private VIP suite on the top floor, Alexander Knight stood perfectly still at the large window. His imposing silhouette was dramatically framed against the brilliant colors of the rising morning sun. His secure cell phone buzzed endlessly on the table with incoming frantic calls from elite journalists, anxious board members, and powerful political contacts, all aggressively demanding his official, exclusive statement on the night's events. He completely ignored every single one of them. His absolute only priority in the world right now was the fragile woman resting peacefully on the hospital bed. Directly behind him, Clara lay in a deep, medicated sleep, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady, reassuring rhythm. For the very first time since the horrific incident occurred, a gentle touch of true peace had finally softened her exhausted, pale features. Alexander's intense, protective gaze lingered on her beautiful face for a very long time before he finally sighed and turned back to face the harsh reality waiting outside the glass. He intimately knew exactly what he had to do next. Richard was obviously already on the massive defensive. Overnight, his highly paid, sleazy PR team had brazenly issued a totally fabricated press statement actively claiming the entire incident was wildly exaggerated by the media. They outrageously claimed that Vanessa had simply tripped on the hem of her gown, and that Clara had hysterically overreacted to an accidental bump. But the high-definition viral videos told a starkly different, undeniable story. Millions of angry people had clearly seen Vanessa's highly deliberate, vicious kick. They had heard Richard's sick, mocking laughter, and they had witnessed Alexander's furious, protective entrance. The global narrative was absolutely not Richard's to control anymore. At 9 o'clock sharp, Alexander walked confidently out of the main hospital doors, flanked heavily by two of his massive, armed personal security guards. The massive crowd of reporters erupted instantly into a deafening roar. Microphones were violently shoved forward over the barricades, and dozens of voices loudly shouted invasive questions all at once. Mr. Knight, are you secretly having an illicit affair with Clara Evans? Did you physically assault Richard Evans at the charity gala last night? Are you actively planning to legally sue Evans Technologies? Alexander simply raised one large hand, and the chaotic noise miraculously instantly dimmed to a quiet hush. His deep, resonant voice, incredibly steady and dripping with authority, carried effortlessly over the remaining chaos of the street. Clara Evans is absolutely not just Richard's wife, he stated firmly, looking directly into the bank of camera lenses. She is an incredible woman. She is a devoted mother-to-be, and she is a human being who was brutally, unforgivably humiliated in front of the entire city last night. She was violently, physically assaulted while carrying an innocent child, and the exact man who should have died trying to protect her actively chose to stand there and laugh. Loud gasps of shock rippled rapidly through the dense crowd of cynical reporters. The massive television cameras zoomed in significantly closer, eagerly capturing every single syllable he spoke. Alexander continued, his commanding tone growing noticeably sharper and infinitely more dangerous now. I absolutely will not allow her to be silenced by expensive PR spin. I absolutely will not allow fabricated corporate lies to cover up exactly what the entire world saw with its own two eyes last night. And I promise you all right now, true justice will be done in this matter. Not tomorrow. Not someday in the distant future. But now. The press pool absolutely exploded, their frantic shouts rising rapidly into a deafening, chaotic frenzy. But Alexander simply turned on his heel and strode purposefully back inside the secure hospital without answering a single follow-up question. His powerful, undeniable message had been flawlessly delivered. The entire world now definitively knew that he wasn't just Clara's old college friend from the past. He was her impenetrable, billionaire shield. Back upstairs in the quiet suite, Clara had just woken up exactly in time to watch the live breaking news broadcast playing on the large flat screen television mounted to the hospital wall. She covered her mouth with physically trembling hands as she watched Alexander bravely defend her on national television. He didn't defend her with quiet, secretive whispers or private words of comfort behind closed doors. He defended her with a massive, public declaration that was powerful enough to completely shake the entire city to its core. Hot, overwhelming tears entirely blurred her vision. Absolutely no one had stood up to defend her in so incredibly long. Not her cruel husband Richard. Certainly. Not his snobby, enabling family. And not even her so-called fair weather friends in high society. And now, here was Alexander Knight, a man with everything to lose, willingly risking his own flawless global reputation just to publicly give her back her stolen dignity. Why? She whispered tearfully when he finally returned to the quiet room, shutting the door behind him. Why on earth would you risk doing this for me? Alexander walked over and looked deeply down at her. His handsome expression was completely unreadable, but his deep voice was incredibly steady and warm. Because the entire world desperately needs to see the absolute truth. And because you absolutely deserve so much more than suffering in silence. Outside the hospital, the massive, devastating corporate consequences were already rapidly unraveling. Frightened, wealthy investors began frantically withdrawing their massive funds from Evans Technologies. The company's stock price violently plummeted by a staggering 15% in a single, chaotic morning of trading. Furious board members actively whispered in emergency meetings about permanently removing Richard from his position as CEO. Meanwhile, Vanessa's haughty face was splashed aggressively across every single trashy tabloid at the checkout stands. Her carefully curated, glamorous reputation was entirely shredded, permanently branding her as the psychotic evil mistress who brutally attacked a pregnant wife in public. But Richard Evans absolutely wasn't completely beaten just yet. High up in his sprawling, glass-walled penthouse office, pure, unadulterated, rage boiled violently inside his veins as he watched Alexander's damning speech. Replay endlessly across every major news network. He violently grabbed a heavy crystal glass off his desk and slammed it aggressively against the wall. The expensive crystal shattered instantly, the sharp shards scattering across the carpet exactly like his rapidly crumbling empire. "If Knight really wants a damn war," he growled ferociously to Vanessa, who was cowering on the couch, "then a total bloody war is exactly what he'll get." And so, the epic battle lines were officially, publicly drawn. It was true. Unconditional love pitted against toxic, blinding arrogance. It was the absolute truth going up against a machine of lies. It was an untouchable billionaire going toe-to-toe against a desperate CEO whose spectacular public downfall was only just beginning. Richard Evans had built his entire massive empire on absolute, rigid control, and publicly losing that control was something his massive ego simply could not physically stomach. For 2 agonizing days, his name had completely dominated global headlines, absolutely not as a brilliant, visionary CEO, but entirely as the monstrous husband who laughed gleefully while his pregnant wife was brutally assaulted. Wealthy investors fled his funds like rats abandoning a sinking ship. His corporate board was incredibly restless and openly hostile. His private phone buzzed endlessly with frantic messages from powerful politicians actively publicly distancing themselves from his toxic brand. Richard paced the length of his massive executive office like a caged animal, his furious anger radiating off him like physical heat. Vanessa lounged carelessly on the expensive leather sofa across the room, casually swirling a heavy pour of red wine in her crystal glass. Her long, crimson-painted nails tapped a lazy, annoying rhythm against the glass as she watched him completely unravel before her eyes. "You're completely finished in this town if you don't aggressively fight back against this," she purred, her voice dripping with condescension. Richard stopped pacing instantly, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous, lethal slits. "Oh, I will absolutely fight back. Clara actually thinks she can publicly humiliate me by cowardly hiding behind Knight's money. But she is legally still my wife. I intimately know all of her deepest weaknesses, and I will personally make the entire world see her as the pathetic, manipulative liar she truly is." He immediately called his highly paid, ruthless PR team into a mandatory emergency meeting. Their new, aggressive strategy was utterly devoid of morals. They would aggressively smear Clara's good name into the mud long before Alexander could successfully elevate it any further. Within mere hours of the meeting, sleazy tabloids miraculously released exclusive, verified leaks about Clara's private life. Highly fabricated stories claimed that she had grown inappropriately close to Alexander long before the charity gala ever happened, heavily implying that her marriage to Richard had been a fake, loveless sham for years. Anonymous close sources whispered terrible lies to reporters about her faking staged tears, painting her as a manipulative, greedy wife who was intentionally using her pregnancy as an emotional shield while actively chasing after the billionaire's massive fortune. On daytime talk shows, paid, loudmouth commentators fiercely debated whether Clara had intentionally played the victim for the cameras. Carefully, maliciously edited video footage from the gala was circulated to make it look exactly as though she had aggressively provoked Vanessa first. A few highly paid, unethical medical experts even dared to publicly question her health on television, cruelly suggesting her fainting spells at the hospital had been dramatically exaggerated purely to gain public sympathy. The coordinated cruelty of the campaign was absolutely staggering. And, horrifyingly, it briefly worked. For a terrifying moment, social media became a vicious, divided battlefield. Many brave people fiercely defended Clara, but thousands of others blindly echoed Richard's expensive, manufactured lies. They viciously called her a greedy gold digger, a calculating schemer, and a weak, pathetic woman who was only using her impending motherhood as her sole value to society. Richard smirked victoriously at his iPad as he watched the trending headlines slowly begin to shift in his favor. See? It's working perfectly. By next week, she'll just be yesterday's forgotten, boring pity story. But Vanessa absolutely wasn't convinced by his temporary victory. She set her wine glass down hard on the table and crossed her long legs, her tone incredibly sharp. You're arrogantly forgetting one very important thing, Richard. The internet absolutely never, ever forgets those high-def videos of you laughing like a psycho. They are permanently everywhere. Absolutely no expensive smear campaign is ever going to fully erase that visual from people's minds. Richard turned on her instantly, his voice dripping with venom. Then we'll just actively make people forget about her instead. You, Vanessa, you will be my new weapon. You won't be the scandalous mistress anymore. You'll be the loyal, loving fiancé. We will publicly announce our immediate engagement to the press. We'll make it look exactly like I've happily moved on from a toxic, abusive wife to a wonderful woman who truly supports me. We will completely control the new story. Vanessa elegantly arched a perfectly sculpted brow. A large, greedy part of her was absolutely thrilled at the thought of finally stepping permanently into the bright spotlight, of finally being significantly more than just the other woman, but another, much smarter part of her whispered extreme caution. Richard was acting incredibly desperate right now. And desperate, cornered men were always incredibly dangerous. Still, she smiled her best. Fake, camera-ready smile. Fine. Announce the engagement. But always remember this. Richard, I am absolutely not just your pretty weapon. I am your ultimate insurance policy. If you ever try to cross me, those encrypted financial files I secretly keep hidden, They will permanently bury you. Richard's jaw tightened in suppressed fury, but he expertly forced a charming smile. We're absolutely on the same side here, darling. For now. By that very evening, glossy press releases flooded major media inboxes all across the city. Billionaire Richard Evans joyfully confirms engagement to Vanessa Moore amidst bitter divorce proceedings. The accompanying paparazzi photos were flawlessly, beautifully staged. Vanessa was shown brightly flashing a massive, flawless diamond ring for the cameras, with Richard's protective hand resting lovingly on her waist. They were both smiling radiantly, exactly as though a horrific public scandal had absolutely never even touched their perfect lives. The brazen move completely shocked the public. Some people saw it as an act of brazen, disgusting arrogance, while others saw it as undeniable proof that Richard truly had absolutely no shame left in his body. But the announcement ultimately achieved its primary goal. It successfully shifted the media's attention. Clara, who was still recovering quietly and peacefully in the hospital, was once again unfairly painted by the press as the sad, discarded wife, the pathetic outsider looking in on her own life story. But what Richard fatally underestimated was the sheer, undeniable, unstoppable power of the absolute truth. Clara's profound silence absolutely wasn't a sign of weakness anymore. It was active, meticulous preparation. And Alexander Knight absolutely wasn't about to just sit back and let Richard maliciously rewrite history without a massive, bloody fight. Because if Richard genuinely thought this cheap tabloid smear campaign was the actual war, he had absolutely no idea about the catastrophic battle that was rapidly coming for him. The hospital room was incredibly quiet again. It was almost entirely too quiet. The massive, expensive floral arrangements sent by hundreds of anonymous, sympathetic well-wishers had slowly begun to wilt and droop in their glass vases, their sweet, vibrant fragrance entirely replaced by the harsh, sterile, chemical bite of hospital disinfectant. Clara sat very still by the large window, dressed in a thin, pale blue hospital gown, her long, dark hair completely unbrushed. Her hands were folded highly, protectively over her swelling belly. She honestly hadn't spoken much more than a few necessary words to the nurses in days. On the flat-screen television securely mounted to the white wall, Richard's incredibly smug, handsome face appeared yet again on the evening news broadcast. This specific time, he stood proudly right beside Vanessa, whose hand was raised high, shamelessly flaunting a massive, blinding diamond engagement ring for the flashing cameras. Their bright, perfectly white smiles were absolutely blinding, and the scrolling headlines beneath them were incredibly, intentionally cruel. Richard Evans engaged to Vanessa Moore, tech CEO happily moving on from toxic marriage scandal. The glowing words cut significantly deeper into her chest than any physical knife ever could. Claire fumbled frantically for the plastic remote on the bed and quickly turned the loud TV off. plunging the room into darkness. But the heavy, suffocating silence that immediately followed was somehow infinitely worse. In the deep stillness of the room, the cruel, judging whispers of the outside world rang, significantly louder in her ears. She's so incredibly weak. She's completely discarded. She is absolutely nothing. Without his money and power. Clara pressed her hot forehead against the freezing cold glass of the hospital window. Hot, bitter tears finally spilling over her lashes and running rapidly down her pale cheeks. Her faint reflection stared blankly back at her in the dark glass, hollow-eyed, exhausted, and utterly broken. She barely even recognized herself anymore. Where was the vibrant, passionate girl who had once dreamed of designing beautiful couture gowns for the world? Where was the optimistic young woman who had once so fiercely believed in the purity of true love? Now, she was just the pathetic, discarded wife who had been publicly laughed at, brutally humiliated, and instantly replaced like a broken toy. Maybe they're actually right, she whispered brokenly to the empty, sterile room. Maybe I really am absolutely nothing. The terrifying thought paralyzed her, but it also wrapped tightly around her throat exactly like heavy iron chains. She had willingly given up her entire budding career, her fierce independence, and her very own voice, all just to please Richard. And now, what exactly did she have left to show for it? A completely ruined public reputation, a shattered, bleeding heart, and a cruel world that either pathetic pitted her or viciously mocked her existence. Her heavy sobs violently shook her entire body. She slid slowly down the cold wall and onto the hard linoleum floor, desperately clutching her belly, whispering endless, frantic apologies to the innocent child who had absolutely no choice in any of this nightmare. I'm so incredibly sorry, she cried, rocking back and forth. I honestly don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I'm actually strong enough to survive this. The dark, suffocating despair violently threatened to completely drown her. She genuinely thought of just disappearing into the night, of fading completely into the quiet background so that the cruel, judging eyes of the world would finally stop watching her fall apart piece by piece. But then, a very specific, rhythmic sound broke entirely through her deep despair. Thump, thump, thump. It was faint at very first. Then it grew significantly stronger and louder in the quiet room. It was the advanced fetal monitor resting beside her bed, still, faithfully and accurately tracking the baby's heartbeat. Clara completely froze on the floor. She slowly lifted her tear-stained head, listening intently to the sound in the dark. Thump, 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 thump. It was incredibly strong. It was beautifully steady. It was undeniably defiant. Against the odds. Her hot tears absolutely didn't stop flowing, but they fundamentally changed. They weren't just useless tears of deep sorrow anymore. They were powerful tears of profound realization. Her baby was still very much alive. Her baby was actively fighting to survive the trauma. Her innocent baby believed in her strength, even when she absolutely didn't believe in herself. Clara slowly, determinedly crawled back up off the floor and onto the hospital bed, her pale hands firmly and protectively covering her belly as if to physically shield the precious life growing within from the cruel world outside. "You're actually still here," she whispered, her voice violently trembling with fresh emotion. "You're still bravely holding on. If you can fight this hard to survive, then so can I." For the very first time in agonizing weeks, something massive and fundamental completely shifted deep inside her soul. The crushing weight of her deep despair absolutely didn't vanish completely, but a bright, fierce spark of pure fire finally lit up within the suffocating darkness. She thought deeply of Alexander. She thought of exactly how he had bravely carried her out of the chaotic Gala in his arms, how he had fearlessly faced the rabid press to fiercely protect her honor when absolutely no one else in the world would. She thought warmly of her loving parents, who had proudly raised her to firmly believe that human dignity was always worth significantly more than all the diamonds in the world. And most importantly, she thought of herself. Not the sad, broken, crying woman reflected in the hospital mirror, but the brilliant, fiery girl who once deeply believed she could create breathtaking beauty from absolutely nothing but raw fabric and a spool of thread. Clara aggressively wiped her wet tears away with the back of her trembling hand. Her voice was significantly stronger now, ringing with absolute resolve. "I absolutely will not let him win this. Not Richard. Not Vanessa. They absolutely do not get to write the ending to my story. I do." The baby's heartbeat pulsed steadily and strongly from the monitor, acting almost exactly as if in agreement with her vow. And right there, in that fragile, sterile hospital room, for the very first time since her entire world violently collapsed around her, Clara rose from the ashes of her deep despair with a brand new, unbreakable vow. She would actively fight back, not just for her own survival, but fiercely for the innocent life growing strong inside her. The hospital officially released Clara exactly a week later. She absolutely did not return to the cold, sprawling Evans penthouse. Instead, she was quietly moved to a beautiful, highly secure, quiet townhouse that Alexander had personally secured and purchased for her entirely under a dummy corporation in his name. It was incredibly simple, highly private, and completely safe. It was a true sanctuary where rabid, screaming reporters couldn't possibly swarm the front doors, and where Richard couldn't aggressively barge in, arrogantly pretending to claim ownership over what he had already so callously discarded. Still, despite the tight security, Clara felt profoundly uneasy in the new space. Each and every single night, she lay wide awake in the unfamiliar bed. The cruel, vicious tabloid headlines constantly replayed on a loop in her anxious mind, and Richard's sickening, Mocking laughter echoed in her ears like toxic poison. She intimately knew that his expensive, ruthless smear campaign absolutely wasn't over yet. He wouldn't ever stop attacking her until he felt he had crushed her spirit completely into dust. One dark, rainy afternoon, while methodically unpacking a cardboard box of her old, personal belongings from the penthouse, Clara stumbled across something strange she hadn't seen in many months. It was a small, external hard drive. It was sleek, silver, and heavily scratched around the metal edges. She vividly remembered the exact day Richard had carelessly tossed it into her designer handbag months ago, immediately after a highly contentious board meeting. He had casually told her to keep it somewhere incredibly safe, acting as if she were his personal storage unit. At the time, she honestly hadn't thought much of the request. Richard very often dumped mundane tasks and items on her, constantly treating her significantly more like a low-level, unpaid executive assistant rather than his actual wife. Now, staring at the scratched metal, her curiosity was immensely piqued. She slowly plugged the small device into the USB port of her laptop, fully expecting to find incredibly boring, mundane corporate files or old tax returns she wouldn't even understand. But as the heavily encrypted folders miraculously bypassed her simple password guess and opened on the screen, her breath violently caught in her throat. Dozens upon dozens of highly classified, restricted documents completely filled the bright screen. There were massive, complex financial spreadsheets, highly illegal offshore bank account routing numbers, and deeply incriminating emails communicating with shadowy, unknown international contacts. Clara rapidly clicked through the digital files, her pale hands physically trembling over the keyboard. Each and every single opened file told the exact same horrifying story. Richard had been actively, illegally embezzling millions upon millions of dollars for years. He had been systematically siphoning his investors' company money directly into untraceable shell corporations spread across the world. Her chest tightened painfully with shock. This absolutely wasn't just basic corporate greed or standard executive overreach. This was massive, highly illegal, federal criminal activity. Scrolling even further down into the directory, Clara unexpectedly found several hidden audio recordings. She clicked one, and Vanessa's distinct, sultry voice spilled out of the speakers, sly, highly manipulative, and actively taunting. Richard, openly admitting to knowing all about his illegal schemes. "Oh, please don't worry about it, darling," Vanessa purred seductively in one particularly damning audio clip. "Absolutely no one will ever find out about the missing money. I will keep your dirty little secret completely safe. Just as long as I am standing right by your side at the top." Clara's stomach violently churned with pure disgust. Vanessa absolutely wasn't just his pretty, disposable mistress. She was his active, willing accomplice. She was his eager blackmailer. She was a literal ticking time bomb sitting right next to him. She quickly pushed the laptop away from her on the table, her heart racing a million miles a minute. Her immediate instinct was that she should immediately call the police. She should instantly send absolutely everything on the drive directly to the Evans Technologies corporate board of directors. But then, a wave of pure, paralyzing fear completely gripped her. Richard was incredibly ruthless and highly dangerous. If he ever somehow discovered that she secretly possessed these highly incriminating files, he absolutely wouldn't hesitate for a single second to silence her, violently and permanently, by any means necessary. Her very first terrified instinct was to immediately close the laptop, wipe the drive clean, and pretend to the world that she had absolutely never seen the data. But then, she gently placed her hand on her belly and thought of the innocent baby, the brave baby who had given her a reason to find strength when she was entirely ready to just give up and die. Could she really, honestly raise her precious child in a corrupt world where a monster like Richard still held massive power and influence? Where his toxic, destructive lies went completely unpunished by the law. Her hand rested firmly on her belly. "No," she whispered fiercely into the quiet room. "Not anymore." Just then, the front doorbell of the townhouse rang loudly. Clara completely froze in her tracks. Pure, unadulterated panic rapidly flooding her chest. She quickly and frantically shut the laptop screen and shoved the silver hard drive deep beneath the plush cushions of the living room couch, before slowly walking over to answer the heavy door. It was Alexander. His expensive, tailored suit was slightly damp from the pouring rain outside. His handsome expression was as incredibly sharp and assessing as always, but his intense gray eyes visibly softened with deep concern the exact moment they met. Hers. "You look incredibly pale," he noted instantly, stepping inside. "What exactly happened?" Clara hesitated for a long second by the door. For a very brief moment, she seriously considered hiding the terrifying truth from him to keep him safe. But Alexander had already willingly risked his own flawless reputation and absolutely everything he had just to publicly protect her. He inherently deserved to know the truth. I found something," she whispered softly, locking the door and leading him into the living room toward the couch. She nervously pulled out the silver hard drive from under the cushions, her hands visibly trembling as she held it out to him. "It's Richard's deeply hidden secrets. His actual federal crimes. It is undeniable proof of absolutely everything." Alexander's sharp eyes narrowed dangerously as he sat down and methodically scanned the complex files on her laptop screen. His strong jaw tightened visibly, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, Clara clearly saw the ruthless, cutthroat billionaire businessman hiding just beneath the gentle protector. She saw the exact, lethal man who was entirely capable of taking down global empires without breaking a sweat. "This," he said incredibly slowly, pointing at the glowing screen, "is Absolutely not just legal leverage. Clara, this is a loaded weapon. He looked up from the screen, his eyes burning with intense fire. With this drive, Richard's entire fake empire will completely and violently collapse into dust. And for the very first time in his arrogant life, he will be the one on his knees begging for mercy. Clara's resting pulse instantly quickened. She physically felt a massive, overwhelming mixture of both sheer, terrifying fear and profound, deep relief. She feared exactly what a desperate Richard might try to do if he discovered she had the files. But she felt immense relief that she finally, truly held the absolute power. For agonizing months, she had been entirely silent. She had been rendered completely powerless, entirely erased from her own life. Now, sitting securely in her own hands, she held the ultimate, golden key to her own grand redemption, and to Richard's absolute, permanent destruction. Clara stood incredibly still in front of the full-length bedroom mirror, staring deeply at the reflection she honestly barely even recognized anymore. For agonizing months, she had looked in the glass and seen absolutely nothing but a hollow ghost staring back at her. She had seen dead, hollow eyes, defeated, slumped shoulders, and a pathetic woman utterly broken by brutal betrayal. But now, staring closely at herself, something fundamental was rapidly and beautifully changing. Slowly but surely, she was actively rediscovering the vibrant, powerful woman she once truly was. The brilliant woman Richard had tried so desperately to systematically erase from the earth. It all started with the discovery of the files, holding the undeniable proof of Richard's dark secrets had miraculously given her significantly more than just legal evidence. It had given her raw, undeniable power. For the very first time since the day of their wedding, Clara absolutely wasn't helpless. She wasn't the weak victim being publicly humiliated by her husband. She literally held the loaded weapon that could easily bring him to his knees in federal court. And that intoxicating realization entirely awakened something ancient and incredibly deep inside her soul. Alexander noticed the profound, physical shift in her demeanor immediately. He had been sitting intensely at the large dining room table, meticulously reviewing the complex financial documents with a highly vetted team of elite private investigators he deeply trusted. But when Clara confidently walked into the room, he looked up from his papers and completely froze. She absolutely wasn't wearing the drab, oversized, gray sweater she had cowardly hidden herself in for weeks. She wasn't physically curling inward to make herself look smaller, acting like someone who was deeply ashamed of simply existing. Instead, she wore a breathtakingly sleek, tailored navy blue dress that beautifully hugged the curves of her growing belly with immense dignity and pride, rather than trying to hide it in shame. Her dark hair, freshly cut and expertly styled that morning, perfectly framed her face in soft, glamorous waves. And her eyes, God, her dark eyes, were absolutely no longer dull or defeated. They burned brightly with a quiet, undeniable, lethal fire. "You look," Alexander began, his deep voice trailing off as he searched his mind for the exact right word. "You look exactly like yourself again." Clara's painted lips curved slowly into the absolute faintest, most confident smile. "Not exactly like my old self, Alex. Significantly better." The dramatic makeover absolutely hadn't been an act of shallow vanity. It was a highly calculated act of actively reclaiming her stolen identity. She had boldly called up her old college friend, a highly successful fashion stylist who still owed her a massive favor from years ago, and asked for her professional help. Together, they had spent hours going through endless racks of high-end clothing, until Clara found the exact, perfect pieces that made her feel like a warrior. Putting on armor. Every single hemline, every specific choice of fabric, was meticulously chosen not to please Richard's archaic tastes, and absolutely not to blend seamlessly into his stuffy corporate world, but to perfectly reflect the fierce, strong woman she desperately wanted to be. As the talented stylist expertly pinned the final adjustments on the navy dress, Clara had looked deeply into the mirror and whispered fiercely to her reflection, "I am absolutely not his tragic victim anymore. I am my child's strong mother. I am me." Now, she sat confidently at the head of the table with Alexander and the elite investigators, listening incredibly carefully as they expertly outlined various lethal strategies for exactly how the stolen files could be best utilized to destroy him. She took detailed, meticulous notes on a legal pad, asked incredibly sharp, probing questions, and firmly made executive decisions. Gone forever was the silent, obedient wife who just nodded blankly while her arrogant husband spoke over her. In her place sat a powerful woman who absolutely demanded to be heard and respected. Alexander watched her work. Immense, glowing admiration flickering brightly in his stormy gaze. This was exactly the brilliant Clara he vividly remembered from their college days, the passionate girl who had sketched beautiful designs late into the night, the optimistic girl who truly believed she could easily change the entire world with nothing but a needle and thread. But now, she was significantly sharper. She was infinitely stronger. She had been brutally forged in the fire of betrayal, and she came out as hardened steel. "We absolutely cannot release these files to the press just yet," Clara said, incredibly firmly, tapping her pen on the table. "If we just randomly leak them online, Richard's PR team will instantly spin it and claim I'm just a vengeful, unstable, jealous ex-wife making things up. We desperately need perfect timing. We need maximum, undeniable impact. I want the absolute truth revealed directly, in front of absolutely everyone in this city who ever doubted me." Alexander nodded slowly, a dark, predatory smile forming. "The massive charity Gala is happening next month. The Children's Future Foundation. Richard is acting as the primary corporate sponsor for the event. The entire executive board, the national press, all of his major investors, absolutely every single one of them will be there. Clara's heart pounded a frantic, excited rhythm against her ribs. The exact same kind of high-profile, glamorous event where her absolute worst, most public humiliation had brutally begun could now serve as the perfect, poetic stage for her ultimate, glorious redemption. Yes, she said, her voice completely steady and cold as ice. That is exactly where his story ends. Later that same quiet night, when the large house finally grew peaceful and still, Clara sat entirely alone in her bedroom. An old, familiar sketchbook resting in her hand. For the very first time in agonizing years, she picked up a sharp pencil and actually began to draw. The initial graphite lines were slightly shaky at first, hesitant and out of practice, but very soon they flowed beautifully across the paper, effortlessly, forming the stunning silhouette of a magnificent evening gown. Her evening gown. She vividly imagined herself walking confidently into that massive, glittering gala, absolutely not as Richard's pathetic, discarded, pregnant wife, but as Clara Evans, entirely powerful, completely unbroken, and utterly, terrifyingly, unstoppable. She closed the sketchbook with a satisfying snap, her warm hand resting protectively on her swelling belly. We're going to show all of them, she whispered fiercely into the quiet night. To her unborn baby. We're going to show them exactly who we really are. And exactly as the massive city of New York slept peacefully outside her window, Clara Evans was finally, beautifully reborn from the ashes. The highly anticipated night of the Children's Future Foundation Gala arrived. Exactly like a massive, brewing thunderstorm. The Grand Imperial Hotel, the exact, opulent place where Clara's horrific public humiliation had violently unfolded just weeks earlier, glowed brilliantly with golden chandeliers and plush velvet carpets once more. A seemingly endless line of sleek, black limousines lined the busy street entrance. Hundreds of flashing paparazzi cameras aggressively captured the city's wealthiest and most powerful elites as they proudly stepped onto the plush red carpet. For the vast majority of the attendees, it was just another boring, glamorous, mandated corporate evening. But for Clara, it was the ultimate, chosen, battleground where she would aggressively, publicly reclaim her stolen dignity. Inside the quiet safety of one of the waiting town cars, Clara took a massive, deep, centering breath. She gently smoothed the luxurious, heavy silk of her bespoke gown. It was the exact, stunning design she had meticulously sketched. During those long, sleepless nights, the dress was a deep, breathtaking shade of midnight blue, entirely covered with thousands of hand-embroidered, tiny silver details that shimmered and caught the light exactly like a galaxy of constellations. The gorgeous gown hugged her changing form beautifully, intentionally celebrating and highlighting her pregnancy rather than cowardly attempting to conceal it under layers of tulle. She was absolutely no longer hiding in the shadows. She was radiant. She was commanding. She was utterly undeniable. Alexander sat quietly right beside her, dressed flawlessly in a tailored, midnight black tuxedo that made his imposing, powerful physical presence seem even more terrifyingly formidable. He glanced over at her in the dim light of the car, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, the notoriously ruthless Billionaire completely softened. "Are you entirely ready for this?" he asked softly. Clara met his intense gaze, her painted lips curving upward into a fiercely confident, predatory smile. "I am more than ready, Alex." When the heavy car door finally opened, the blinding flashes of the paparazzi cameras erupted instantly like violent fireworks. Seasoned reporters literally gasped out loud in shock as Clara stepped gracefully out onto the carpet, her pale hand resting incredibly lightly and confidently on Alexander's offered arm. She walked forward with the absolute, undeniable grace of a conquering queen, finally returning to reclaim her stolen throne. Every single step she took was highly deliberate, every fluid movement entirely defiant of their expectations. The initial shocked gasps quickly turned into frantic, excited murmurs, and then, surprisingly, into genuine, spontaneous applause from the crowd. "Is that really Clara Evans?" one veteran reporter whispered loudly to his colleague, completely stunned. "She looks absolutely incredible," another photographer replied, snapping photos frantically. "And she's walking in with Alexander Knight? My God, the front page headlines are literally going to write themselves tomorrow." The grand entrance immediately devolved into absolute, frantic chaos as journalists aggressively scrambled and pushed each other for better photos. Clara kept her chin held incredibly high, absolutely refusing to be cowed or intimidated by the noise. For the very first time in her life, she wasn't walking into a gala acting as Richard's quiet, submissive accessory. She was walking in entirely as herself, and the entire watching city could physically feel her immense power radiating off her. Inside the massive, gilded ballroom, the entire atmosphere shifted violently and instantly. Richard and Vanessa had confidently arrived much earlier in the evening, acting incredibly smug and overly confident. Vanessa was obnoxiously flaunting her massive, new diamond engagement ring to the crowd like it was a stolen crown jewel. But the exact moment that Clara and Alexander confidently entered the room, the entire axis of the room violently tilted. Loud, booming conversations stopped completely dead mid-sentence. Crystal champagne glasses paused awkwardly halfway to parted lips. Every single eye in the massive ballroom turned simultaneously toward her. All the healthy color completely and instantly drained from Richard's arrogant face. He gripped the stem of his crystal champagne flute so incredibly tightly that the delicate glass audibly cracked, spilling expensive liquid down the cuff of his custom tuxedo shirt. Vanessa's arrogant, plastic smile violently faltered. Pure. Unadulterated jealousy flashed hotly in her dark eyes as she helplessly watched the entire elite crowd naturally gravitate toward Clara in awe. Clara didn't falter for a single second. She walked purposefully right past their table, her midnight blue gown sweeping across the floor like a massive wave of power, her dark eyes remaining completely steady, cool, and calm. She absolutely didn't need to shout or make a scene. Her sheer, overwhelming presence in the room was significantly more than enough to completely silence every single doubt and every single cruel word that had ever been spoken about her. Behind her back, Alexander leaned in incredibly close to her ear, his deep voice low but incredibly firm. They absolutely cannot ever touch you anymore. The excited whispers in the massive room grew significantly louder as she walked. Wealthy guests who had once looked down on her and pitied her now stared at her in absolute, genuine awe. Even the corporate executives who had blindly sided with Richard shifted incredibly uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly terrifyingly realizing that they had massively underestimated the brilliant woman he had so foolishly cast aside. At the exact center of the ballroom, Clara paused gracefully. The massive, dripping crystal chandeliers directly above seemed to physically spotlight her, casting her in a warm, ethereal glow that made her look completely untouchable. For a long, agonizing moment, the silence in the room was absolute and deafening. Then, incredibly slowly, applause began to break out. It started first from a very small group of powerful women standing near the main stage, and then it spread rapidly like a wildfire until the entire massive ballroom thundered, deafeningly with clapping hands. Richard's strong jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Vanessa's manicured hand dug painfully into his arm. And Clara? She simply smiled. Not out of toxic arrogance, but out of pure, hard-won triumph. For the very first time in a very, very long time, she finally felt entirely whole. She wasn't just barely surviving her life anymore. She was spectacularly winning it. But the chaotic night was incredibly far from being over. Because buried deeply and securely in her designer clutch was the silver hard drive, the ultimate loaded weapon that would violently, permanently expose Richard's massive empire of lies to the federal authorities. And when the perfect moment finally came to use it, she was more than ready to strike the fatal blow. The massive, glittering gala positively pulsed with electric tension as Clara and Alexander took their prominent VIP seats near the very front of the stage. Seated directly, intentionally across the aisle from Richard and Vanessa. The heavy air between the two warring couples crackled violently like a live, exposed electrical wire. Wealthy guests whispered frantically behind their hands. Cell phone cameras flashed discreetly from under tables, and the live orchestra's incredibly elegant, sweeping music could barely even begin to mask the overwhelming, room-wide undercurrent of sheer anticipation. Richard leaned aggressively toward Vanessa, his jaw locked tight with anger. His voice a low, furious hiss. Do absolutely not react to her. Do not give her the sick satisfaction of seeing you upset. But Vanessa was already seething with uncontrollable rage. Her perfectly painted, crimson lips curled into a very bitter, ugly smile as she helplessly watched Clara laugh incredibly softly at something charming Alexander had just whispered in her ear. The agonizing sight of Clara looking so incredibly glowing, so totally confident, and so completely adored by the elite crowd was absolutely unbearable to her ego. For many long weeks, Vanessa had proudly been the undisputed queen of the city. Richard's new chosen one, the beautiful woman standing firmly in the bright spotlight. Now, in one single, humiliating instant, Clara had completely, effortlessly stolen absolutely all of it back. When the lavish, five-course dinner finally ended and the long, boring corporate speeches began, the simmering tension in the room rapidly reached its absolute breaking point. An oblivious, wealthy guest sitting at their table asked an incredibly innocent question à simple, polite remark regarding the ongoing, vague rumors swirling around Richard's tech company's recent stock performance. Vanessa's dark eyes suddenly glittered with malicious, drunken pride. She had been desperately waiting for this exact moment to brag. She had consumed far too much champagne to care about discretion. Oh, please, she said incredibly loudly, her shrill voice carrying easily across the large table and into the quiet room. If the clueless public only knew even half of the brilliant, complex things Richard has successfully pulled off just to keep that massive company afloat and thriving. The entire surrounding area of the room quieted instantly. Dozens of heads turned sharply, ears straining to catch the gossip. Richard completely froze in his chair, his hand tightening violently around the stem of his wine glass. Vanessa, he hissed dangerously under his breath. Shut up right now. But Vanessa, completely intoxicated by her own blinding jealousy and the expensive champagne, merely smirked at him defiantly. What's the big deal? It's honestly not a secret to anyone in this room. Everyone here knows that. Incredibly rich men constantly bend the boring rules to win. Hidden offshore accounts, creatively falsified revenue numbers. It's exactly how all massive empires are built today. Isn't that right, darling? The specific, dangerous word offshore landed in the quiet, crowded ballroom. Exactly like a live, unpinned hand grenade. A massive, shocked murmur violently swept through the entire ballroom. Cell phones instantly rose into the air, aggressively recording the meltdown. High-end cameras zoomed in tightly on their table. Wealthy guests leaned intently forward in their chairs, their faces completely lit up with scandal-hungry, ravenous curiosity. Clara's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She sat perfectly, unnaturally still in her chair, but deep inside, pure, hot adrenaline surged through her veins. Vanessa had literally just publicly, drunkenly confirmed exactly what the stolen files on the silver hard drive already explicitly proved to be true. The massive difference was that now, the entire watching world had just heard it straight from the horse's mouth. In Vanessa's very own, careless, arrogant words. Richard's handsome face turned a mottled, violent shade of red with pure fury. He grabbed Vanessa's bare arm so incredibly hard that it made her gasp out loud, in genuine pain. "Do not say another damn word," he snapped viciously. But it was entirely, spectacularly too late. Alexander stood up slowly from his chair, his incredibly deep, commanding voice effortlessly cutting right through the rising noise of the crowd. "You all just clearly heard her speak," Alexander announced to the room. "Vanessa Moore, Richard Evans's former mistress and now his current fiancée, has just publicly, openly admitted to massive, illegal financial activities, operating entirely within Evans Technologies, hidden offshore accounts, heavily falsified federal numbers." He turned slowly to face the massive audience, his physical presence completely commanding the attention of the hall. "This is absolutely no longer just a nasty tabloid rumor. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a highly public, legal testimony." The massive room erupted into total chaos. Greedy journalists scrambled frantically to text breaking updates to their bewildered editors. Wealthy, panicked investors whispered furiously to one another, already planning their exit strategies. Richard tried desperately to rise to his feet, shouting angrily over the chaotic noise to defend himself, but his voice was completely drowned out by the mob. Vanessa, finally, terrifyingly realizing exactly what she had just stupidly done, turned sickly pale. I absolutely didn't mean to imply," she stammered weakly. But the devastating public damage was entirely irreversible. Her blind ambition and her toxic arrogance had finally, fatally slipped into pure, unadulterated recklessness. Clara rose incredibly slowly from her chair, her stunning, midnight blue gown shimmering beautifully under the light of the dripping chandeliers. She placed her pale hand incredibly gently, protectively on her swelling belly before confidently stepping forward. Her clear voice rang out, perfectly calm, entirely steady, and devastatingly cold. "This is exactly the man who callously mocked me in public. This is the man who cruelly abandoned his own family, who laughed gleefully while I was physically attacked on this very floor," she declared to the room. "And now, you all finally see exactly what kind of corrupt, toxic leader he truly is behind closed doors. His massive lies are absolutely not just personal failings, they are massive, federal professional crimes. They dangerously endanger every single investor, every innocent employee, and every trusting family directly tied to Evans Technologies." Her powerful words miraculously silenced the absolute chaos in the room. For a long, breathless moment, the entire massive ballroom hung silently on her every word. Richard lunged desperately forward, his carefully cultivated mask of calm. Finally, violently breaking, his face completely twisted with pure, animalistic desperation. She is absolutely lying to all of you. She is just a bitter, incredibly jealous ex-wife. But Vanessa, physically trembling and still heavily half-drunk, shockingly cut him off with a sob. No, Richard. She's absolutely not lying. The devastating, unexpected confession hung heavily in the air, exactly like a final, signed death sentence. Huge, collective gasps swept violently across the room. Richard staggered backward as if he had been physically struck, his massive, billion-dollar empire completely collapsing around his ears, not with a loud, explosive bang, but with a single, pathetic slip of the tongue from the exact woman he arrogantly thought he entirely controlled. And Clara, standing tall and proud in the spotlight, for the very first time in her life, felt the immense, heavy weight of true justice finally tipping entirely, permanently in her favor. The massive ballroom was in a state of absolute, unmitigated chaos. Vanessa's disastrous, drunken slip of the tongue still hung incredibly heavily and toxically in the stale air. Every single wealthy guest in the room was buzzing frantically with shock. Cell phones were aggressively recording the meltdown, and the bright flashes of paparazzi cameras went off relentlessly like a violent lightning storm. Richard's handsome face was completely pale with unadulterated fury. His flawless, arrogant mask of total control now entirely, irreparably shattered into a million pieces. He desperately tried to shout loudly over the rising, deafening noise of the crowd, but his panicked words were completely drowned out by the mob of angry investors and hungry journalists. Clara stood incredibly tall in the exact center of it all, her stunning, midnight blue gown glimmering beautifully beneath the light of the crystal chandeliers. For the very first time in her adult life, she absolutely wasn't trembling with fear. For the very first time, she wasn't cowardly shrinking away under his massive, imposing shadow. Tonight, she unequivocally held all the power in the room. She calmly reached into her designer evening clutch and slowly pulled out a small, scratched silver hard drive. It was the very same drive Richard had once carelessly, arrogantly tossed at her months ago, never in his wildest nightmares, imagining that his discarded wife would eventually weaponize it to become the fatal sword of his spectacular downfall. She held it up high in the air for absolutely all the cameras to see. Vanessa's shocking words tonight are absolutely not just drunken hearsay, Clara declared, her voice incredibly strong and ringing perfectly clear, amplified beautifully by the stunned silence that suddenly fell over the massive ballroom. I have the undeniable, hard proof. I have the digital proof of absolutely every single federal crime Richard Evans has ever committed. The illegal offshore bank accounts, the heavily falsified corporate earnings reports, the massive, multi-million-dollar embezzlement. Loud, Horrified gasps rippled violently through the elite crowd. Several prominent, wealthy corporate investors rose furiously from their seats. Their faces completely dark with righteous anger and profound betrayal. Nervous board members exchanged deeply panicked, terrified glances. The aggressive press corps immediately surged forward against the tables, absolutely hungry to catch her. Every single word on tape. Richard lunged violently toward her across the floor, his voice raw with pure panic. Clara, stop this right now. You have absolutely no idea what you're doing to me. But Alexander seamlessly stepped directly between them. His broad, imposing frame acting as an impenetrable physical shield for her. His deep, resonant voice thundered dangerously across the hall. No, Richard, Alexander boomed. For agonizing years, you have successfully violently silenced her. Tonight, she finally speaks to the world. Clara moved confidently toward the AV booth and calmly connected the small silver hard drive directly to the main projector that was set up for the evening's Gala charity presentations. The massive 30-foot digital screens positioned all around the ballroom flickered briefly, then suddenly lit up brightly with the highly classified files. Massive, detailed spreadsheets showing millions in missing corporate funds. Undeniable. Time-stamped bank wire transfers sent directly to secret numbered Swiss accounts. Lengthy, damning email chains completely filled with highly incriminating, illegal evidence. Absolutely every single elite guest in the room watched, completely horrified, as the absolute truth poured out onto the screens in cold, hard, undeniable numbers. A deafening hush completely fell over the room as one specific, highly confidential internal email appeared on the screen in massive font. It was Richard's own unmistakable words, glowing brightly on the giant screen for all to read. Move the embezzled money to the Cayman accounts immediately before the federal auditors arrive tomorrow. And make absolutely sure my stupid wife Clara never finds out about this. Clara's voice cracked very slightly with emotion, but it absolutely did not falter in strength. You cruelly mocked me in public, Richard. You aggressively tried to completely erase my existence from the world. But I was absolutely never weak. I was never blind to your sins. And now, absolutely everyone in this city clearly sees exactly who you really are in the dark. The profound silence that immediately followed her speech was absolutely deafening. Then, exactly like a massive concrete dam violently breaking, the entire room erupted into chaos. Furious investors shouted aggressively at him, some physically storming out of the ballroom in utter disgust to call their lawyers. Journalists scrambled frantically over chairs to capture every single frame of the projected evidence on camera. Richard's own corporate board members whispered furiously to one another in the corner, already actively planning his immediate, disgraceful removal as CEO. Richard stumbled backward away from the screens, his hands physically shaking uncontrollably, heavy beads of cold sweat dripping rapidly down his pale temple. This is all completely taken out of context, he stammered wildly to the crowd, his voice cracking. She's maliciously twisting the narrative to ruin me. Clara, please, think of the innocent baby. At the desperate mention of their unborn child, Clara's dark eyes hardened into pure, unyielding stone. Don't you dare, she said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper that somehow carried across the room. You permanently lost the absolute right to ever use our baby as a convenient excuse the exact moment you stood there and laughed at my physical pain. Her powerful words cut significantly deeper into his soul than any physical knife ever could. The entire crowd completely turned on him. Where once Richard had been the absolute, untouchable golden boy of Wall Street, now he was a pathetic, ruined pariah. His massive, billion-dollar empire was literally collapsing into dust in real time. Heavily armed hotel security guards, men who were once deeply loyal to his massive paycheck, stepped aggressively forward toward him at Alexander's subtle, commanding signal. Vanessa sat completely frozen at her table, her face deathly pale. Finally, horrifyingly realizing that she had single-handedly, permanently sealed both of their tragic fates tonight. For all her brilliant, ruthless scheming to reach the top, she had tragically become the exact spark that lit the raging fire of Richard's spectacular downfall. As a screaming, protesting Richard was aggressively escorted out of the ballroom by security, Clara finally felt her adrenaline crash, her knees weakening slightly. But Alexander expertly caught her by the waist before she could even begin to fall. The entire room, still buzzing loudly with the shock of the massive scandal, now turned its collective gaze solely onto her, not with pathetic pity anymore, but with profound, undeniable awe. She had actually done it. She had successfully, flawlessly exposed him to the world. For the very first time in her life, Clara wasn't just Richard Evans's quiet wife. She was Clara Evans, the incredibly brilliant, powerful woman who single-handedly brought a corrupt, billionaire titan permanently to his knees. The bright, cold morning immediately after the chaotic gala, the global media headlines were absolutely, relentlessly merciless. Richard Evans fully exposed, massive financial crimes uncovered live at charity. Gala. Pregnant wife's incredible courage single-handedly brings down toxic tech. Titan. Vanessa more drunkenly confirms Evans's federal crimes and stunning public slip. Every single major news channel on television continuously replayed the dramatic, high-definition cell phone footage of Clara standing incredibly tall and composed, fearlessly unveiling the stolen digital files for the entire world to see on the massive projectors. The once deeply revered, untouchable CEO had rapidly become a pathetic, global spectacle of absolute disgrace. Inside the towering, glass-walled Evans Technologies corporate headquarters, the Panicked board of directors gathered urgently in a highly tense emergency meeting. The heavy atmosphere in the boardroom was completely suffocating. Powerful men and women who had once meekly bowed to Richard's every aggressive demand now whispered fearfully in the corners, shaking their heads in utter disbelief at the sheer magnitude of his fraud. Richard violently stormed through the heavy doors, his expensive silk tie completely loosened, his eyes heavily bloodshot and wild from a frantic, sleepless night of panic. "This is all completely ridiculous," he barked aggressively at the table, slamming his hands down. "I single-handedly built this entire company from nothing. Absolutely none of you ungrateful bastards would even be sitting here today without my genius. You actually think you can just throw me out into the street because of a few doctored fake computer files?" The chairman of the board, a stoic, gray-haired industry veteran who had stubbornly defended Richard's aggressive tactics for years, slowly cleared his throat. His deep voice was incredibly firm, but heavy with undeniable legal finality. "It's absolutely not just a few fake files, Richard. It is hard, undeniable federal evidence, and the SEC is already actively investigating the company. Accounts as we speak. Our major investors are rapidly pulling out their funding. Our global stock price violently dropped by a staggering 30% just overnight. If you remain in this building for another hour, this entire company dies with you." The corporate vote that followed was incredibly swift, utterly brutal, and completely unanimous. Richard Evans was officially, permanently removed from his position as CEO. He left the quiet boardroom looking sickly pale and physically trembling, his massive, billion-dollar empire literally slipping right through his sweating fingers. The horde of news cameras waiting aggressively outside the building's glass lobby eagerly captured every second of his humiliating downfall. He was once the arrogant, untouchable darling of Wall Street, and was now just a pathetic, disgraced man aggressively shoving past shouting reporters, muttering empty, desperate threats under his breath. Back at his sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse, Richard violently slammed the heavy front door shut. Pure, unadulterated rage boiling uncontrollably inside his veins. "I'll easily rebuild it all," he growled ferociously into the empty foyer, pacing like a caged animal. "They absolutely can't do this to me. I'll come back 10 times stronger and crush them all." But when he aggressively turned the corner into the master bedroom, Vanessa was already there, frantically packing her designer clothes into massive suitcases. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. Vanessa didn't even bother to stop and look at him. "I'm leaving," she said, coldly, violently zipping up her expensive designer suitcase and straightening her posture. "Do you honestly, truly think I'm going to go down in flames with you? You're completely finished in this town, Richard. Your name is absolute toxic poison to anyone who touches it. I am absolutely not ruining the rest of My life for a pathetic man who can't even manage to keep his own illegal secrets, safe from his stupid wife. Richard's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. You literally told me you loved me. Vanessa actually laughed out loud. The sound was incredibly cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of any human empathy. I loved exactly what your money gave me, Richard. But you absolutely don't have a single thing left to give me anymore. She aggressively brushed right past him, her sharp heels clicking loudly and mockingly against the polished marble floor. At the front door, she paused and turned back, her cruel smile returning. You arrogantly thought you completely controlled my life, she said smoothly. But to me, you were always just a convenient, wealthy stepping stone. Goodbye. Richard. The violent slam of the heavy penthouse door echoing behind her sounded exactly like a fatal gunshot in the empty room. Entirely alone now, a shaking Richard poured himself yet another massive glass of liquor, his pale hands trembling so violently he spilled it on the counter. He was so consumed by his panic that he barely even noticed the loud, authoritative knock at the front door until it grew significantly louder and sharper. Highly irritated and heavily intoxicated, he stumbled over to open it, fully expecting it to be a persistent reporter. Instead, he was greeted by two stern-looking federal agents, aggressively flashing their gold FBI badges. Richard Evans, you are officially under federal investigation for massive corporate fraud, grand embezzlement, and severe securities violations. You'll need to come with us right now. Richard's crystal glass violently slipped from his shaking hand, shattering loudly into a million pieces on the hard marble floor. You absolutely can't do this to me, he stammered wildly, backing away in terror. I'm Richard Evans. I have the best lawyers in the city. I have massive power. But the seasoned federal agents absolutely didn't flinch at his pathetic outburst. They calmly and professionally recited his Miranda rights as they aggressively cuffed his wrists and led him away, his frantic protests growing significantly weaker and more pathetic with every single step he took. Outside the building, the paparazzi cameras flashed brilliantly yet again, eagerly capturing the once mighty, arrogant CEO being forcefully escorted out of his very own luxury building in heavy steel handcuffs. For Clara, peacefully watching the breaking news broadcast from the safety and warmth of Alexander's private townhouse, the entire moment felt incredibly surreal. She had desperately, quietly imagined this exact day in tearful whispers, in frantic, desperate prayers in the dark. But to actually see his downfall play out so incredibly, spectacularly publicly was entirely overwhelming. She pressed a warm, protective hand gently to her pregnant belly, whispering softly to her child, "It's finally over. He absolutely can't ever hurt us anymore." And yet, deep down in her soul, she inherently knew that this was only the very beginning of her story. Because while Richard's massive, toxic empire had finally rightfully collapsed into dust. Clara's beautiful, incredible journey was only just starting. It was a profound journey, not just of basic survival, but of glorious, undeniable rebirth. The entire world had eagerly watched Richard Evans's spectacular, humiliating downfall in real time. Endless, looping footage of his pathetic, crying arrest completely dominated absolutely every single news channel and social media feed. Globally, his once pristine, carefully curated public image was permanently, irreparably tarnished beyond repair. But exactly while Richard's massive, corrupt empire aggressively crumbled into dust, an entirely different, incredibly beautiful story miraculously rose from the ashes. It was the inspiring story of a brave woman who absolutely refused to be violently silenced. Clara Evans. For the very first time in her entire adult life, her name was prominently splashed across global headlines, absolutely not as Richard's quiet wife or the disgraced CEO's pregnant spouse, but fiercely as the powerful woman who had bravely exposed massive corporate corruption with unmatched courage and unshakable dignity. Clara Evans, from humiliated wife to fearless heroine of justice. Pregnant woman, single-handedly brings down corrupt tech titan. A true symbol of strength, Clara Evans inspires millions globally. The media coverage was absolutely relentless. But this specific time, it wasn't vicious or cruel. It was deeply admiring, profoundly respectful, and almost entirely reverent. Daytime talk shows debated her incredible psychological resilience. Women from all across the entire country wrote her thousands of emotional letters, tearfully thanking her for publicly showing the world that female silence was absolutely not a sign of weakness. Social media platforms flooded endlessly with viral, empowering hashtags, stand like Clara, strength and grace, and her voice matters. At very first, Clara was completely overwhelmed by the massive outpouring of love. Sitting quietly in the sunlit living room of Alexander's townhouse, she scrolled slowly through the endless, glowing articles and supportive posts, her pale hand physically trembling with emotion. For so incredibly long, every single news headline she read had felt exactly like a jagged dagger aimed directly at her bleeding heart. Now, reading these beautiful words of support, they felt exactly like a warm, soothing balm, miraculously healing deep psychological wounds she had honestly thought would never, ever close. Alexander quietly entered the cozy room, carrying 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea. The entire world has finally seen you exactly the way I always did, he said incredibly softly, handing her a mug. Clara smiled a very faint, teary smile, her dark eyes misting over. It honestly feels so strange. Alex, I really don't know if I actually deserve all of this praise and attention. Alexander knelt gracefully on the floor directly beside her chair, gently taking her free hand in his warm one. You absolutely earned every single bit of it, Clara. You bravely fought back when absolutely no one else in the world thought you could. You stood up incredibly tall when he desperately wanted you to crawl on your knees. Clara, you didn't just heroically save yourself from him. You successfully gave immense hope to every single woman out there who has ever been violently silenced by a man. His powerful, sincere words settled incredibly deep into her healing heart. For so many agonizing years, she had actively defined her entire existence solely by Richard's intense cruelty, and by the crushing, daily humiliation she had been forced to endure in silence. But now, she was entirely being defined by her own undeniable courage, by her fierce maternal strength, and by her stubborn, absolute refusal to break under pressure. That same evening, Clara unexpectedly received a formal, highly prestigious invitation from a major, global women's rights organization. They desperately wanted her to be the primary keynote speaker at their massive annual empowerment summit. She hesitated for a long moment, anxious nerves violently twisting into knots in her stomach. Speaking publicly to a massive crowd had absolutely never been her designated role in life. She had always been the exceptionally quiet one, the invisible, supportive shadow hiding obediently behind Richard's blinding spotlight. But Alexander placed the heavy, embossed invitation incredibly gently in her lap. You absolutely don't have to do it if you don't want to, he said softly. Entirely supportive. But if you do choose to speak, your voice could genuinely change millions of lives. Clara looked slowly down at her swelling belly, physically feeling the incredibly soft, reassuring flutter of new life kicking within her. Her unborn baby. Her absolute reason for fighting. Her unshakable anchor to reality. She straightened her shoulders proudly. I'll absolutely do it. The massive summit was held in a grand, towering auditorium completely filled to the brim with thousands of passionate women from absolutely every background imaginable. There were eager university students, high-powered corporate professionals, exhausted mothers, and brave domestic survivors. When Clara confidently stepped out onto the brightly lit stage, a profound, immediate hush fell over the entire, massive crowd. She wore a stunning, simple, flowing white dress that symbolized pure rebirth. Her dark hair was worn loose and natural, and her facial expression was incredibly serene, yet undeniably strong. For a brief, terrifying moment, she completely froze at the podium. The immense, crushing weight of so many expectant eyes pressed down heavily on her shoulders. But then, she clearly thought of Richard's cruel, mocking laughter. She thought of the physical pain of Vanessa's vicious kick. She thought of the countless, agonizing nights she had spent crying entirely alone in the dark. And most importantly, she thought of the tiny, rapid heartbeat on the monitor that had miraculously given her the strength to survive it all. Her voice, though slightly soft and trembling at first, grew infinitely stronger. and more resonant with every single spoken word. For agonizing years, I foolishly believed that maintaining my silence was the only way to ensure my survival, she began, looking out into the crowd. I deeply believed that if I just kept quiet, if I politely endured the endless humiliation, I could somehow miraculously protect my family, protect my dignity, and keep my rightful place in the world. But that toxic silence very nearly destroyed my soul entirely. What ultimately saved my life was finally remembering that I was absolutely not just an obedient wife. I was not just a pathetic, helpless victim. I was a strong woman, a fierce mother, and a human being who fundamentally deserved basic respect. The massive audience erupted into deafening, thunderous applause. Many women rising instantly to their feet, hot tears streaming openly down their faces. Clara's own eyes blurred heavily with emotion, but she smiled brilliantly through the tears. That beautiful night, as she stepped gracefully off the stage, greedy reporters absolutely didn't swarm her with invasive questions. Instead, thousands of women respectfully reached out their hands to her, not aggressively asking for cheap autographs, but reaching out for true solidarity, for immense gratitude, and for profound hope. Clara Evans had successfully become significantly more than just a famous name. In the tabloid headlines, she had beautifully become a global symbol of survival. And for the very first time in her entire life, she finally felt completely worthy of it. The deafening, roaring applause from the Empowerment Summit still echoed beautifully in Clara's mind hours later. She sat peacefully in the quiet warmth of Alexander's luxurious townhouse. The chaotic, loud hum of the bustling city, outside entirely muted by the thick, soundproof glass windows. Her elegant white dress had been carefully taken off and folded away, and she now comfortably wore a simple, oversized cashmere sweater. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, and all her stage makeup was completely washed off. For once in her life, she absolutely didn't feel the crushing, exhausting need to hide behind flawless, curated appearances. Alexander entered the cozy living room carrying 2 steaming porcelain cups of hot chamomile tea. He set one down incredibly gently on the glass coffee table, before sitting closely beside her on the couch. His formal suit jacket was completely gone, his collar unbuttoned, and his tie heavily loosened. In that quiet moment, he looked significantly less like the untouchable, terrifying billionaire the financial world knew, and infinitely more like the sweet, passionate college boy she had once met years ago. The exact same boy who had looked at her amateur design sketches exactly as if they were priceless masterpieces. "You were absolutely extraordinary tonight," he said incredibly softly, his gray eyes full of awe. "The way you spoke to them, you deeply moved every single person in that room. You completely moved me." Clara lowered her eyes, her cheeks flushing, slightly embarrassed but profoundly touched by his praise. "I honestly wasn't entirely sure I could actually do it. My knees were violently shaking behind the podium the entire time. He smiled a warm, reassuring smile. Absolutely no one in that room noticed you. Shaking, Clara. They only saw your undeniable, immense strength. A comfortable, deep silence settled easily between them, incredibly cozy yet undeniably heavy with years of unspoken memories and lingering feelings. Clara gently traced her pale fingers along the gold rim of her teacup. Her voice, hesitant but brave. Do you ever really think about the past, Alex? About exactly what we could have possibly been together? Alexander's intense gaze darkened with profound emotion. Every single day of my life. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. She slowly looked up, finally meeting his stormy gray eyes. They absolutely held no pity, no judgment, only pure, unadulterated sincerity. And something else entirely. Something incredibly deep that made her battered heart ache with longing. I really should have told you back then, Alexander continued, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. I should have told you exactly how incredibly much you truly meant to me. But you just disappeared. One day you were there, smiling at me, and the very next day you were completely gone. And I foolishly, stubbornly told myself that we just weren't meant to be. Clara swallowed hard, fighting back fresh tears. My beloved father got incredibly sick. Alex, my family desperately needed my help to survive. I honestly couldn't complicate things by selfishly falling in love with you when absolutely everything else in my world was violently falling apart. So, I just walked away. His strong jaw tightened with emotion, but his deep voice stayed incredibly gentle and understanding. You didn't just walk away from me, Clara. You took a massive, irreplaceable piece of my heart with you when you left. Hot tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She absolutely hadn't expected his honest words to hit her so incredibly deeply. For long, agonizing years, she had desperately tried to convince herself that what they had shared in college had just been a fleeting, silly crush, nothing more than naive, youthful dreams that didn't matter in the real world. But hearing him speak now, with such profound sincerity, she finally realized that it had always been incredibly real. And then Richard came along, she whispered bitterly, staring down at her tea. He aggressively promised me ultimate security, financial stability, and safety. I honestly, foolishly thought I was choosing my path wisely to protect myself. Instead, I completely, utterly lost myself to his ego. Alexander reached out and gently took her small, trembling hand in his. His physical touch was incredibly steady, remarkably grounding, and entirely safe. You absolutely didn't lose yourself, Clara. You were simply buried alive under the heavy weight of his cruelty. But tonight, the brilliant, powerful woman I always believed in finally stood up in front of the entire world again. Her chest tightened painfully, a beautiful, terrifying warmth rapidly spreading entirely through her veins. She desperately wanted to protest his praise. 2. Loudly remind him of all her ugly scars, her massive mistakes, and her lingering, paralyzing fears. But instead, she surprisingly found herself leaning significantly closer to him, irresistibly drawn to the absolute safety and comfort of his physical presence. "I honestly don't know if I'm entirely ready for a relationship," she admitted, her voice incredibly fragile. "I am still actively healing from severe trauma, and I have an innocent child's future to constantly think about now." Alexander's thumb brushed incredibly softly, reassuringly over the back of her hand. "I am absolutely not asking you for any grand promises right now, Clara. I am simply asking you for a chance to proudly stand right beside you, not dominantly in front of you, to fiercely protect you when you need it, but also to happily step back and let you fight your own battles. A chance to finally love you in the exact, beautiful way you always deserve to be loved." Her tears finally fell freely down her cheeks, but they absolutely weren't sad tears of dark despair. They were beautiful tears of profound release, of something incredibly fragile and precious finally breaking wide open inside her guarded chest. She leaned forward slowly, resting her tired forehead gently against his broad, strong shoulder, her voice trembling with emotion. "I absolutely don't want to be alone in this world anymore, Alex." His strong arms came securely around her, holding her tightly against his chest, exactly as if she were the absolute most precious, valuable thing in the entire universe. "You absolutely never will be again," he whispered fiercely into her hair. And for the very first time in agonizing, lonely years, Clara Evans finally allowed herself to truly believe it. The highly anticipated day arrived incredibly quietly, entirely without the flashy glamour of a high society gala or the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras. It was very early dawn. The city sky still painted a cool, muted gray, when Clara felt the very first, incredibly sharp, breathtaking wave of pain ripple through her abdomen. Hours later, she was lying exhausted in a sterile, bright hospital delivery room, aggressively clutching Alexander's large hands so incredibly tightly that her pale knuckles turned stark white. He had remained faithfully by her side through every single agonizing moment of the labor. He was completely, unshakably calm whenever she panicked in pain, and incredibly steady whenever her physical strength faltered. He constantly whispered sweet, grounding encouragements into her ear, his deep, resonant voice acting as the solid anchor that successfully kept her from completely breaking under the immense physical pressure. And then, after many grueling hours of intense struggle, the delivery room was suddenly, miraculously filled with the absolute most beautiful sound she had ever heard in her entire life, the loud, healthy, furious cry of her newborn child. Hot tears of pure joy spilled freely down Clara's exhausted cheeks as the smiling nurse gently placed the swaddled baby directly into her waiting arms. He was incredibly tiny, Absolutely perfect, with his little eyes squeezed tightly shut and his tiny fists curled up tight. The beautiful baby was a living, breathing miracle. Clara tenderly pressed her trembling lips to the child's soft, warm forehead, sobbing softly with overwhelming relief. "You're finally here," she whispered to him. "You're completely safe now. You're entirely mine." Alexander stood incredibly close to the bed, his storm-gray eyes glistening brightly with unshed tears as he gazed down at them both in pure awe. For a formidable man who had successfully conquered massive global boardrooms and effortlessly bent entire financial markets to his absolute will, this was the exact, profoundly human moment that finally, beautifully broke him wide open. "He's absolutely perfect," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Clara smiled brilliantly up at him through her happy tears. "Meet your new son." The crushing, suffocating weight of the past traumatic months entirely lifted off her shoulders as she held the innocent baby close to her heart. For so incredibly long, her life had been entirely, unfairly defined by public betrayal and private humiliation. Now, resting safely in her arms, was undeniable, living proof of her fierce resilience, proof that true love could miraculously survive unimaginable cruelty, and that beautiful, new life could actively blossom even after total devastation. The quiet, peaceful days that immediately followed were a chaotic, exhausting, but beautiful blur of sleepless nights, soft, whispered lullabies, and profound, quiet joy. Alexander was faithfully there for absolutely all of it. He was happily changing dirty diapers with surprising, practiced skill, gently rocking the fussy baby to sleep whenever Clara desperately needed to rest, and fiercely watching over both of them with an unwavering, absolute devotion that healed her soul. But Clara intuitively knew that life absolutely couldn't just be solely about motherhood. She knew deeply that if she truly wanted a safe, secure future for her son, she had to actively, bravely build one herself. When the panicked, desperate corporate board of Evans Technologies, desperate to somehow miraculously salvage the ruined company's completely trashed public reputation, approached her with a massive offer, Clara faced a monumental choice. They desperately wanted her to officially step into a major leadership role as a board member, hoping to instantly restore public faith in the very company her disgraced ex-husband had nearly completely destroyed. At first, she heavily hesitated. She absolutely wasn't a ruthless businesswoman. In their eyes, she was just the discarded wife, the sympathetic victim of the scandal. But Alexander quickly reminded her of exactly who she truly was. "You are infinitely more than just Richard's sad shadow, Clara. You're incredibly brilliant, highly creative, and undeniably resilient. You absolutely don't need to prove your worth to any of them. You just need to be your authentic self. And I promise you, that will be more than enough." With his unwavering, fierce encouragement, she boldly accepted the offer. Clara's very first, highly publicized public appearance at Evans Technologies. Acting as a corporate leader was met with stunned, absolute silence from the press and employees alike. She was absolutely no longer the timid, quiet wife who always hid obediently behind Richard's massive ego. She stood proudly before the skeptical employees and wealthy investors with undeniable poise and grace. She didn't speak to them in the cold, calculating language of profit margins or ruthless expansion. Instead, she spoke with immense, genuine passion about corporate integrity, ethical innovation, and the crucial importance of actively rebuilding public trust from the ground up. Her powerful words resonated deeply throughout the company. For the very first time in years, the terrified employees saw a true leader actually worth following. Staff members who had constantly feared for their job security under Richard's tyrannical reign now felt genuine hope for the future. Cautious investors, initially incredibly wary of the massive scandal, were deeply intrigued by her vision and willingly gave her a chance to prove herself. The hungry press eagerly captured absolutely all of it. Photos of Clara confidently holding her newborn son in one arm while brilliantly speaking with strength and vision at a podium went massively viral online. She was no longer just viewed as a struggling single mother, and not just the sad widow of a terrible betrayal. She was universally hailed as a powerful woman entirely reborn. She had successfully become both a fierce protector and a brilliant corporate leader, expertly balancing late, exhausting nights of baby feedings with early, high-stakes morning board meetings. It absolutely wasn't easy. There were inevitable tears of frustration, moments of bone-deep exhaustion, and fleeting seconds of intense self-doubt. But every single time she looked deeply into her beautiful baby's innocent eyes, she instantly found a massive well of strength she didn't even know she possessed. And Alexander was always faithfully right there. He wasn't aggressively overshadowing her accomplishments, and he certainly wasn't trying to control her decisions. He was simply standing proudly beside her, his unconditional love incredibly steady, safe, and absolutely sure. One quiet, rainy evening, as she gently rocked her infant son to sleep in the nursery, Clara whispered softly to him in the dark, "You will safely grow up in a beautiful world where the absolute truth actually matters, where true love is incredibly strong, and where you will always know that your mother absolutely never, ever gave up fighting for you." Her infant son's tiny, warm hand curled tightly and instinctively around her index finger. And in that perfect, quiet moment, Clara knew with absolute certainty that the terrible nightmare was permanently over. A beautiful, brand new story had finally begun. It was nearly a full year after the horrific, chaotic night that had violently changed absolutely everything in her life. Brilliant, warm spring sunlight streamed beautifully through the towering, arched glass windows of the Grand Imperial Hotel. It was now proudly hosting an entirely different kind of high-profile gala. It was absolutely not an event. built on toxic arrogance, fake corporate showmanship, or cruel vanity, but one built entirely on genuine, profound hope. The children's future foundation had proudly and unanimously invited Clara Evans to be their exclusive, highly anticipated keynote speaker. The massive, opulent ballroom was completely packed to the brim. Wealthy, reformed investors, passionate social activists, respected journalists, and, everyday, inspired citizens had all gathered eagerly to hear from the incredible woman whose powerful story of survival had entirely captured the world's attention. She was the woman who had been brutally humiliated in public, completely broken by betrayal, and who had miraculously risen from the ashes, significantly stronger and more powerful than ever before. Clara stood quietly backstage in the shadows, gently adjusting the small microphone clipped discreetly to her stunning, elegant emerald gown. Out in the massive audience, Alexander sat proudly in the very front row. There, beautiful, growing son was nestled comfortably and safely in his strong arms. The happy baby's soft, joyful coos drawing warm, genuine smiles from absolutely everyone seated around him. Clara's racing heart instantly steadied at the beautiful sight of her family. For agonizing years, she had nervously walked into crowded rooms entirely alone, feeling utterly uncertain, deeply afraid, and violently silenced by a monster. Tonight, she was walking into the room as a triumphant woman with her beautiful family supporting her, her powerful voice clear, and her undeniable dignity fully intact. The professional announcer's booming voice echoed loudly through the grand hall. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our incredibly special guest of honor for the evening, Clara Evans. Deafening, thunderous applause instantly erupted as she stepped gracefully out of the shadows and directly into the bright, warm spotlight. She paused for a long moment at the podium, intentionally letting the overwhelming, positive energy of the moment wash completely over her soul. Then, finally began to speak. Exactly 1 year ago, she said, her voice ringing out incredibly clear and remarkably steady over the speakers, I walked into this very same ballroom, living in absolute, paralyzing fear. I walked in as a naive, devoted wife who had been maliciously betrayed, brutally humiliated in front of my peers, and violently silenced. That terrible night, I literally fell to the hard floor in sheer physical agony, and I honestly thought that my life story had completely, tragically ended right there in the dirt. The massive crowd was completely, utterly silent, hanging intently on her every single word. But the story absolutely didn't end there, Clara continued, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Because profound pain is absolutely not the end. Vicious betrayal is not the end. That horrific night was actually the glorious, messy beginning of discovering something incredibly powerful that I didn't even know I possessed inside me. Absolute strength. Her dark, confident eyes swept slowly across the massive room, warmly meeting the expectant faces of the audience, both young and old. For entirely too long, I foolishly believed that maintaining my silence was the only viable way to guarantee my survival. I believed that if I just kept my mouth shut, if I politely endured the constant, daily humiliation, I could somehow magically protect my family, my dignity, and my rightful place in the world. But that toxic silence very nearly destroyed my entire soul. What ultimately saved my life was finally, truly remembering that I was absolutely more than just someone's quiet wife. I was vastly more than just someone's pathetic victim. I was a strong woman, a fierce mother, and a human being who, fundamentally, undeniably deserved basic respect. Wild, spontaneous applause rippled loudly through the captivated audience. But Clara raised her hand incredibly gently to quiet them, continuing her speech. With growing passion, I proudly stand here before you today not just to speak for myself, but to speak loudly for every single woman in the world who has ever been violently told to stay quiet and know her place. For every single person who has ever been cruelly mocked, intentionally ignored, or maliciously erased from their own life. I want you all to explicitly know this. Your voice absolutely matters. Your absolute truth matters. And when you finally find the immense courage to speak up, you will absolutely not only save your own life, but you might just miraculously save others, too. Her voice trembled slightly with overwhelming emotion, but her inner resolve remained entirely rock steady. Richard Evans aggressively tried his absolute hardest to completely break my spirit. He ultimately lost absolutely everything he valued in this world. He lost his massive company, his flawless reputation, and his physical freedom, entirely because he fatally underestimated the immense strength of the very woman he arrogant thought he perfectly controlled. But this story absolutely isn't just about him anymore. It's deeply about the countless brave people out there right now who desperately need to see that even in the absolute darkest, most terrifying moments of life, the brilliant light can always return. Clara glanced lovingly down toward the very front row, where Alexander smiled up at her with profound, bursting pride, their beautiful son resting peacefully and safely against his broad chest. A single, happy tear slipped slowly down her cheek, but she proudly let it fall without wiping it away. I successfully rebuilt my entire life from the ashes, she declared powerfully. I found a true, unconditional love that is incredibly real. A solid support system that is entirely unwavering. And a beautiful, bright future for my child that is completely safe. And I promise you this, if I can miraculously rise up from the cold floor of this exact ballroom, then so can you. The massive hall instantly erupted into a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. Thousands of people clapped wildly, openly cried tears of joy, and loudly shouted her name in solidarity. For once in her life, the overwhelming, chaotic noise didn't frighten her or make her want to hide. It completely filled her soul with profound, unshakable peace. As she gracefully left the bright stage, Alexander rose quickly to meet her at the bottom of the stairs, their happy son held securely between them. He leaned in and kissed her temple incredibly softly, his voice full of awe. "You actually did it," he whispered into her hair. Clara smiled a brilliant, blinding smile through her happy tears, gently wrapping her arms around both him and her baby, holding them incredibly close to her heart. "No," she said softly, her voice full of absolute, eternal love. "We did it." And in that perfect, quiet moment, the epic story that had once begun in horrifying betrayal and public humiliation officially ended, not in toxic, lingering bitterness, but in absolute, spectacular triumph, profound healing, and undeniable, true love. So, my wonderful friends, that is exactly how this incredible, emotional story finally comes to an end today. You're absolutely still right here with me, aren't you? If you have faithfully stayed listening until this very final moment, it means that something profound in Clara's difficult journey truly touched your heart today. And maybe, just maybe, her story beautifully reminded you of your very own hidden, dormant strength. You see, this chaotic life will inevitably break us down at some point. Selfish, cruel people will absolutely betray our trust. But as the brilliant Stoic philosopher Epictetus once wisely taught us, we absolutely cannot choose our external circumstances in life, but we can always choose exactly how we respond to them. Clara bravely chose to rise. She fiercely chose undeniable courage over toxic silence, and she chose profound dignity over absolute despair. And making that one powerful choice completely changed the trajectory of her entire existence. So, if you are currently facing massive, terrifying struggles in your own life right now, please always remember this absolute truth: you are infinitely stronger than you think you are. You have the power to rebuild your life from the ashes. Now, if this powerful story moved your soul even a little bit today, please do not just keep it to yourself. Like this video right now, share it with someone in your life who desperately needs a message of hope today. And please subscribe to our growing channel, because right here, together, we can keep telling beautiful stories that actively heal the world. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next video.